In the depths of the forests of Lemuria, a little boy called Hercules rushed on horseback, screaming frantically that he would never become an emperor. He was the third prince. After the death of his father, Emperor Adrien III, the throne remained vacant at first. Hercules did not even look as the heir, but his older brothers were so unbearable that they were now removed by fate. For him, even a small and weak country is worse than any torture. Because of the dullness of his brothers, he was needed to lead the state that may soon die, and he wanted only a peaceful, carefree life. But suddenly someone caught up with him, and strictly asked not to be selfish. He recognized this voice. It was Caroline, his childhood girlfriend. She always followed him, and this time did not retreat either. Hercules and Imagine could not go so far to catch. His Caroline demanded that he stopped, and asked why he escapes. The looked around the guy. Just clarified whether she was still haunted by the girl sarcastically. Caroline insisted that he stopped fleeing and accepting Emperor Hercules only mentally. He believed that she just jokes. He would never agree to rule a weak, doomed country. Caught up with Hercules, Caroline, without hesitation, struck him right on his head from the blow. The guy flew from his horse and glowed to the ground. The girl jumped out of the saddle and sat on him She cast a harsh look at him and confidently declared, "You caught you." Hercules annoyedly glanced at her. Once the Lemurian Empire was a huge covering 3 continents. It was the most powerful military, economic, and cultural state of the world. Lemuria left her mark in history, once built by elves, and she was a real center of power. Once upon a time, this country was the most powerful state of the world, but the civil war split it east and the west. The western part was completely destroyed, and the eastern Lemurian Empire was slowly declining under the pressure of other races' invasion. The country lost more than 60% of its lands and continued to weaken due to the lack of fertile lands and access to the sea. Trade almost stopped, and the lack of resources only increased, and it was assigned to rule this empire that balanced on the verge of collapse, or was there any hidden importance? Once upon a time, 19 years, Lemuria, Adrien III came to the peasants in the field. He welcomed how they lived. One of the elves low and replied that thanks to his majesty, everything was going well. The elves smiled and noted that if things would continue to go this year, the country would not know the emperor's famine, but still apologized for the difficulties that he had to worry about his people. Then he addressed Hercules, asking how he stressed that this land was huge and destined. The 4-year-old girl turned to Hercules, but he didn't even lift his head. Sitting just in the field, Guy was immersed in reading a book. The emperor came closer and suggested Hercules to take a stroll and look at the country that he would be able to read the book later. However, the boy was not looking away from the pages, only indifferently answered that he was just a wheat field, and he was more interested in the book. Without hesitation, the emperor grabbed a book out of his hands. He explained that the author of this book sees the world only through words. But this is not enough. Life is more than just red lines. You need to feel it. Hercules finally looked away from the book and glanced towards 2 peasants. He asked his father that they were doing that. They replied that they were cleaning the wheat grains, of which they would later bake bread. The guy watched their work carefully and noticed that the wooden sticks they used looked uncomfortable. After pointing at them, he suggested that instead of sticks, make something like a comb. Hercules explained that with the new instrument, people would work faster, their hands would not get tired, and the crop could be hammered for a few years ahead. Instead of relying only on the strength of hands, is much easier to pull the grain with 2 hands using their own weight. And if you create a small platform, even children could help. Smiling, Hercules turned to his father. This approach will save a lot of effort and significantly increase the productivity of the emperor, shone with joy, praising his son for his mind. But at the same time, the king did not understand where the guy knows such things. Hercules explained that such instruments existed in the era of Edo. They were created by farmers who developed innovative agricultural tools. By the emperor, only surprised to look at him without understanding what he talks about. The guy was confused for a moment and then in a hurry replied that he learned from a foreign book. The king smiled and called him a true all-knowing. But Hercules just looked at his father silently, knowing that such information was not in their libraries or archives. It was his secret. He possessed knowledge of more advanced technologies but kept them secret. Because of this, he was often called a prodigy, and his father performed any request. However, it was this knowledge that became a trap for him. All overestimated him. And now he loses freedom of Caroline still sitting on him, that he finally accepts his fate of the emperor. Hercules blushed at her feet and grumbled her to climb because she would only bend a heavy girl, and asked if she flew again if she released him. Then with surprise, adding something to the guy felt by a guy, and began to beat his fists on the ground with his fists. Caroline continued to persuade him he has knowledge and abilities to become an emperor. But Hercules abruptly denied it. Never, when he grows up, he wants to travel the world and not become a prisoner of this country. Following, he sharply asked her to get off, saying that he would not allow himself to turn herself into a prisoner emperor. It sounded as if he just didn't want to be near her. But Hercules did not understand that Caroline was referring to it seriously, and said that this land was loved by this land where his father was ruled by Emperor Adrien, and she wanted to protect her, always dreaming of seeing Hercules to revive the Lemurian Empire. Caroline was tears and confessed that she wanted to see him by Emperor Hercules, made herself struck by her words. Embarrassed, he asked why she was crying. Her teeth, the guy swallowed a ball in his throat and realized. He said heavily, hesitantly, that he may have taken Caroline with him on a trip, instantly stopped crying, wiped tears, and asked if this truth. Hercules stroked her on her head and said that she would do everything she would like for her. Caroline cunningly whistled and asked if he would let her read the Forbidden Mother's book about martial arts, and even came to tea, and of course, whether the guy nodded even without thinking. But suddenly he noticed her cunning smile and a vigilant look directed at him. Caroline sharply grabbed him by the collar and pulled her. Hercules scraped out as a questioning that she was doing. But the girl only cold-blooded replied that a real warrior was using any weapon, even the trick was so, always saying his father always. She stubbornly pulled him forward, and he struggled that she was fooling him. And that's so against his own will. Hercules found himself in front of his subjects. So he eventually went on the throne and became an emperor. Sitting in the royal chair by throwing his feet on the table, he sighed to be an emperor in such a country that's already a real punishment. The constant trade deficit, continuous invasions of other races that decreases every day. Because of all this, the empire lost its power and viability. Of Hercules could not believe that his father died by such a state. His freedom continued too little. Suddenly he felt a tense, ominous aura. It was a feeling as if someone was watching him from the darkness. He turned and saw a smiling girl. She smiled cunningly, and said that she was right. Her voice was solemnly judged to become an emperor. She gave him a lot of knowledge about the other world, and sincerely hoped that he would be able to use them properly. In fact, Hercules had knowledge from another world, but they were not his own. They belonged to the one who was born and raised on planet Earth in the country under the name of Japan. His name was the Sicarius Shichi. All the difficulties of which Hercules have encountered to this point, he could solve them only because he had knowledge from another world. And all this was the antics of that bizarre demon. An angry guy asked if she understands what headache he now had. In his past life he was boring and simple. But this knowledge was invaluable. Before the disappearance of the demon, only mysteriously smiled and said that he puts great hopes on him. Hercules grabbed his head and shouted he wanted to renounce the throne immediately. It was at this moment that an elf passed. He stopped at Hercules. And you were wrapped in a person, not like a person who just became emperor. This was his uncle, Christopher Augustus. Hercules looked at a man with a man in front of him, and asked whether he was really his relative. He was not like his family members. In any case, the guy was convinced that he suggested his father this crazy idea. Although Hercules had two brothers, Uncle always put him above them. It was a real kara. Christopher thoughtfully rubbed his chin and said he didn't remember doing something like this. But his brother Adrien was constantly talking about Hercules. In 3 years, he was able to read and write in 4, reading all the books in the castle library. But he was not proud to tell that the guy did not get tired of studying the martial arts, Hercules sharply, and grunting to Christopher to finally fell silent. In addition, his uncle heard that the guy invented a sembakoki device that significantly increased the efficiency of wheat collection. Since then, the yield began to grow in geometric progression. Christopher smiled and said that the people, and even the late emperor, would be delighted with it, with conviction that Hercules' climbing on the throne was the right solution. The guy laid his head on the table and dreamed of a rebellion that would drop him from the throne. But at that moment, the door sharply dissolved, and the man solemnly turned to his imperial majesty. Uncle smiled cunningly and said that he was a person who would just turn the whole atmosphere of Hercules just twisting. Realizing that the situation became even worse, Galf was always unsuccessful in his calculations. He spoke so loud that even Uncle and Hercules were forced to cover the ear. Galf stated that all decisions on the management of the empire should go through it. Behind him came quietly Patriarch of New Lemuria Lucanos, and Miyako asked Galfa not to scream so loudly. Lucanos explained that the emperor is still too young for such loads because he was only 12 years. Hercules was convinced this country doomed to rise from a chair. He indifferently stretched his crown and said that they can engage in politics. In the meantime, he plans to simply enjoy books in the library while everything rolling into the abyss. Patriarch smiled sadly and sighed that you will not do anything again on Lady Caroline. Hercules stood by the window of the library, looking at the dying country in which he had to be born. He mentally cursed this world for such an unjust joke. And behind the walls of the castle, millions of people led to him pleading to save their country. The guy put a book in front of him and quietly said that only they gave him peace outside this castle on him a lot. He lifted his head and smiled, books his best allies. The only thing that could snatch him out of this tight, suffocating world. Expanding the book, he turned to her in his thoughts. What world would you show me today? But he did not have time to plunge into reading, as suddenly from the horn popped out. Caroline forced him to shudder. Hercules nervously looked at the girl. She frowned and shouted loudly that she had again caught him after escaping from his duties. She already knew that he again evaded work again. The guy tried to justify the declaration that in the Empire and so too many people who managed the country, so he did not need Caroline, that he had never forced anyone to engage in politics, and just the title of emperor. The girl narrowed his eyes and asked if he was talking at all in politics at all. Hercules sharply returned to her his gaze. What did you just say? He asked. A squeezed book by Caroline looked, and quietly said that she was sorry, for even Emperor Adrien himself recognized him. Caroline with contempt called it shame. She believed that Hercules could instantly solve the financial problems of the empire if he wanted, but she apparently was mistaken for him only 12 years. The girl was strictly asked what his father would think if he heard these words. At that moment she suddenly felt a dark, oppressive aura. Hercules slowly rose from the floor and asked cold, "You really consider me a baby?" He was perfectly understood by the policy. He just surprised how little Caroline knew about him. Hercules confidently stated that as soon as he fully understood the root of the problem of solving it, would become a simple. Caroline, skeptical of his eyebrows, and asked if he could really do something just now, caused the guy a wave of outrage. He agreed once she insists. Hercules solemnly promised that for 5 years he would remove the empire from the financial crisis. But then stopped for a second, he thought, and corrected himself. He will do it in 3 years. By pointing on a Caroline finger, the guy added, if he fulfilled his promise, she will have one request. The girl hesitated for a moment, but in the end, Caroline proudly stated that he was ready to do all that he desires. On the face of Hercules appeared an echidna smile. You said it herself, said that he said it. Thus began the difficult journey of the young Emperor Hercules. Using his knowledge, he sought to conquer 3 continents as an emperor of divine light. However, the current state of the Lemurian Empire was pathetic. She suffered from the loss of territories of collapse. The capital of the empire was known as a city where 2/3 of world wealth is concentrated. The Lemurian Empire has accumulated enormous wealth due to smuggling of goods through its territory. Its prosperity lasted for many years supported. However, this type of trade had 2 serious shortcomings. First, depended on the political situation and economic conditions in the countries of importers and exporters and friends. All these wealths inevitably passed through the neighboring state of the main enemy of the Empire Kingdom first. Lily looked at the bookshelf seeking the right. Tom, finally finding it, he opened a book and delved into reading. Hercules thought of the Empire urgently need to find a new source of income that is independent of transit trade. When he gathered, all the key advisors of the servant were shocked. But at the same time, the Emperor finally revealed the initiative. Alina, Uncle, and others looked at each other. Uncle did not even restrain tears and said, Hercules, that now when he made this decision, he became a real emperor. They believed that this decision would save the Lemurian Empire from decline. Everyone praised Caroline, stroking her on her head for helping to convince Emperor Hercules. Angrily glanced at her. He remembered his loud promise to improve the country in just 3 years. What a fool was. But now it was impossible to retreat. Patriarch was skeptical whether it seems to be a crazy idea to try in 3 years to revive the economy by closing the book. Hercules sighed and acknowledged that it was not easy, but to begin, he offered to make the first step to organize light export of goods. In addition to wheat, which is the main food in the empire, also grow grapes and grape olives used for the production of wine, and from olives receive olive oil. 2 main export goods of the empire. In addition, Lemuria is famous for its high-quality glass and ceramics. These products are the main sources of income and financial stability of the empire. But the same goods produce in other countries. Moreover, the craft industry of the kingdom was the first to be no worse than Lemurian, because Hercules thought about creating a unique product of Lemuria. His idea interested all those present, and they began to reflect on his words. Doors opened and the hall entered the maids. One of them carried a tray with mugs and then began to fill them with drink. She poured boiling water and put a mug on a table. Heroes looked at him astonished with a rich black drink. Hercules took one of the mugs, and noticing their indecisive views, calmly said not to be afraid of this drink. His own invention, they exchanged surprised views, without realizing that it was for a liquid guy offered them to taste. During the tasting, Christopher noted that the drink had a rather strange aroma one after the other. Everyone took a cup and made a sip of Galf curled and immediately splashed horribly. But the patriarch smiled and noticed that he feels the energy, he even likes it. Caroline suggested that this medicine was because the drink was bitter. Hercules took her mug, poured some milk, and then stirred to try again. Looking in a Caroline cup with surprise, she saw in the foam a picture in the shape of a cat. Her eyes shone, and she did not restrain the smiles of Hercules' cunning. He smiled. He did the same thing in every mug, then calmly crossed her hands on his chest. He offered everyone to taste again. Everyone made a few more swallows. Galfy surprised that the drink became much more pleasant to taste. But the patriarch denied that he liked the original variant of Caroline with foam from the drink under his nose, smiled and said Hercules that it was delicious. The guy nodded and pointed to the mug. This drink is called coffee. Uncle repeated this word by trying to utter him correctly. Caroline asked his father whether he could never hear about something like. Hercules smiled, wiping Caroline foam from his lips. He explained that he learned about coffee during one of his travels a few years ago. She was grown in monasteries to help the ministers stay cheerful for a long time. In Lemuri, there were few sources of drinking water, so that it was difficult. Because of this, the main drinks in the empire remained grape wine and beer that could be stored for a long. Unlike coffee tea, it was not on the market at all. It did not have developed production, and its cultivation remained unknown, however. The climate and the soils of Lemuria were quite suitable for its cultivation. If the empire made coffee with its exclusive product, Christopher agreed that coffee could become a unique product for the empire, but recognized that the drink himself did not make a strong impression of Hercules. In surprise, looking at him without understanding what he implied in mind, he specifically purchased a tea service in the eastern countries, where he was producing the most expensive porcelain. They know that. But then the guy lifted his mug and calmly said this porcelain made in the lemur. Patriarch Lucano shook his head, saying that it was impossible. White porcelain was exclusive technology of Oriental silk countries. Even Kingdom Fries and Mimeria could not produce his words. Not surprised Hercules. The guy explained that this porcelain is not a classic Oriental product, but a bone porcelain was developed in London in about the 18th century. Caroline was surprised to be surprised without understanding what London. Hercules added that the characteristic white color of this material was obtained by the bones of animals. He meant that earlier, the whole porcelain they made black, so he decided to replace her with white. In fact, this option was still at the stage of the experiment, but looked incredibly sophisticatedly affected by Uncle grabbed Hercules by his shoulders and exclaimed that it was just great. For a long time he thought that Lemuria was frozen in development, but now he realized that she was capable of such exquisite technologies. Galf was shocked, and could not imagine that His Majesty would show them something so unexpected and unique. Hercules, however, the perfection was still far from the time they had too little coffee for the mass sale of the first priority task, to find masters capable of making bone porcelain and convincing churchmen to grow coffee trees on their lands. The best starting option would be to sell a set of 2 products and coffee. Hercules smiled cunningly and announced, "We will sell coffee and bone porcelain. It will become unique lemur products." His design quickly found support among those present. Everyone hoped that would be the first step towards the financial recovery of the Caroline Empire. Proposed to start sales as soon. Now he only had to study administrative documents carefully. In the library, he raked a bunch of old books, took a pen, and began to draw a scheme on a wooden malbert with a fixed piece of paper. Lily thoughtfully looked at the drawings 3 months from the moment he began to study administrative documents, and finally was able to establish the cause. Sitting among the many scrolls and books, Hercules made sure that his suspicions were the right main causes. Servants led by Hercules gathered around a big table. He gestured them to start. Hercules apologized for an unexpected collection, but explained that they urgently should take steps to stabilize the empire. One of the men at the table skeptically asked if the 12-year-old boy Carlane cited at the head of the meeting skewed. I hastily glanced at him by ignoring the comment addressed to a stranger. Before you had not seen a guy nervously with a pupil. and I was a Krau. The empire tax system works. Krau began reading. The imperial tax system consists of 6 main types of taxes: land tax, powder tax, trade tax, import tax, military tax. In addition, the empire has a monopoly on the salt. Hercules nodded and praised Krau for a clear explanation, calling him to continue. Krau was stunned by the fact that the emperor himself approved his work. In the meantime, Hercules considered the information received. He stated that the poll tax, trade tax, import tax, tax on slave release, and monopoly on salt should be cancelled or viewed in the hall. The silence all stunningly looked at him and then began to repeat the said. Some not understood how to collect enough taxes at all. Initially, he took up the poll tax of his uncle, stretched him a piece of statistics, running through the figures of Hercules, said that this list contains data about the population from which the poll. He conveyed a document with Kraulu and asked that he thought the guy looked at the numbers carefully and noticed that in the list too many women. Hercules smiled and confidently pointed his finger to the point. And there are many people with physical disabilities here. He explained that in the empire, a poll tax for men is higher than for women with physical disabilities. But these reports only a piece of paper for 4 men and 2 women could easily get tax privileges. The country lives 10 million people, and physically it is impossible to check everyone. Because of this, people began to falsify data attributed to their listening problems or invented other defects to avoid taxes, and as statistics show it successfully. Hercules looked at the data obtained by the audience with his eyes, and quietly asked if any of you can be sure that this information is reliable. Hercules could not tolerate the tax system that did not work properly by chopping coffee. He firmly stated that it should be cancelled by the members of the council, did not even try to dispute it. Crowlett was amazed at these bureaucrats, which usually argued so loudly, now sitting silently. Not knowing what, Hercules apologized to him for constantly commenting him to comment on everything, and asked to explain the taxation system of Kraull's taxation, that the tax rate for merchants depends on their income and product category. Hercules swirled and asked, "And where do you know how much the merchant really earns?" Krull replied that they rely on his words. Hercules came close to him and burned. That is, they could just lie them enough? Merchants could easily fake financial statements by declaring one amount reform. He turned his gaze to the next item in the list. Import taxes that rather interfered with the flow of goods than brought considerable income to the treasury, and then the tax on the release of slaves in the modern empire. Almost no one released slaves, so that this tax was outdated and meaningless. Hercules decided to cancel both the tax roll. Squeezing from the mug, Hercules went to the question of monopoly on salt. This policy was introduced by his father, Emperor Adrien. She gave the empire a stable source of income, compensating for the losses they could not receive through a poll tax. Salt was sold 30 times more expensive than its real value. People needed salt, so they bought it despite the price. Of Hercules smiled at the bureaucrats and said it's certainly favorable. Hercules took a small bag from the tray and put it on the table in front. Hercules returned to Caroline and suggested to taste the contents. The girl came up a little on her finger, and she tried thoughtfully, nodded. This ordinary salt. It was ordinary legal salt, better and much cheaper than monopolized imperial salt, more openly sold on the streets of the capital at an affordable price. If such salt was free for sale, it meant only one in the shadow managed this process. Hercules did not go to just so put up with this. Bureaucrats lowered his heads, avoiding his gaze. He strictly examined the audience and asked cold whether they were mocking from his father's tax system. And then, looking directly in the eye, asked, "One of you at all built a monopolized imperial salt?" Crowl with horror watched their reaction. It was impossible. Unexpectedly, Hercules smiled, and in a calm voice asked all for apologies. Bureaucrats shuddered, looking at him with horror and surprised. It was obvious that this system was unviable, and from the very beginning it was invented only to patch holes in the disposed tax system. Hercules decided to cancel the monopoly on salt. In addition, he was ready to close his eyes on the problem of smuggling of salt, but he had one condition. Bureaucrats alertly looked at and asked what he was in mind. Hercules calmly stated that the merchants wanted to create a trade union. It caused the surprised views of Krull too. Looked at him without understanding what it leads. The guy explained, "If you continue to use old accounting methods of merchants, and will continue to falsify their income, and without a clear organization, it will be impossible to trace how they work and what real profits get. If the merchants had created a trade union, it would greatly simplify control of their income. Instead of checking each merchant separately, the government could carry out cross-checks between the trade union and its members, as well as between different trade unions. It would give an empire a certain control over the economy. However, trade unions could lead to a rise in prices. If they set the price for one product, other traders wishing not to keep up too, to raise their prices to make a profit. The main threat was that trade unions could monopolize the market by setting the highest prices and forcing everyone to trade everyone on their terms. But among the bureaucrats and representatives of the aristocracy, trade was considered the case of the lower class. One of the officials even stated that real money is not earned because of the purchase of sale, but thanks to the mind and strategic thinking of Hercules, looked at him with interest and asked sarcastically, "And how you earn a life with this way?" Raise prices. If you mindlessly increase the value of a product, no one will buy it, and it just rot. In addition, Hercules already knew that merchants have long formed their own unofficial unions, so he decided to use it in his favor. By waving his hand, he gave a signal to the military, who distributed to each bureaucrat new documents. This project of the new tax system declared Hercules, but he did not want to make this decision individually, so asked them to make their proposals and make changes if they consider it necessary. "There are no emperors or bureaucrats here," firmly said Now. "Here, only people who seek to revive the Lemurian Empire and those who are able to do it." He urged them not to be afraid to challenge his decisions and put forward counter-arguments. In fact, he understood that bureaucrats get low salaries, which was a surprise for them, so he declared if fiscal reforms would be successful, he personally takes care of a fair increase in their remuneration. Smiling with Hercules cheerfully. So let. Thus began passionate debates that lasted 3 days and 3 nights. In the process of numerous views and adjustments, the new taxation system was finally formed and officially announced throughout the empire. And 2 years after its introduction, the tax revenues of the Lemurian Empire increased about 1.5 times compared to the previous period. This became the first real step to the revival of the state's greatness. The use of taxes in particular, the expenses for the staff of the imperial palace, was revised to reduce the burden on the state treasury. In addition, all values belonging to the imperial house, but had no historical significance, were uniformly sold. Thus, the financial situation of the Lemurian Empire began to gradually stabilize up to 14 years. Hercules not only restored the economy, but also gained strong support from merchants who were responsible for national logistics. "It's just great," Caroline exclaimed that Hercules managed to correct the position of the empire in less than 3 years. The guy smiled and tricky, to stroke him on the head. The girl first agreed, but discontinuing his cheeks with her hands quickly. Then she had seriously asked whether he was going to the city. "Hercules just crumbled for you. I am the same Hercules who was always in the eyes of the rest of the world." A completely different person was suspicious of narrowing eyes. "This magic?" The guy quickly lifted his finger to her lips. "Hint Christopher, and others will temporarily take things on themselves." Having reached out to Caroline, he solemnly declared, "Today, I want to introduce you to the 4 main monuments of Lemuria." Giudice, surprised, tilted her head. "And what is it for places?" The first stop was the museum. A huge hall was filled with monumental statues and impressive works of art. Caroline looked at the exhibits incredibly. How many artistic masterpieces here. Hercules, crossing my hands on his chest, smiled. I smiled at myself. He reminded her of the time when they opened the imperial warehouses together during the financial inspection. Then he wanted to sell excess arts to replenish the treasury, but among them were many things with great historical value, and some were just too valuable to sold in them. There was so much they decided to create a museum where these values could persist, and at the same time bring the benefit of the Caroline Empire. Paid attention to the luxurious vase, and asked if it was stored earlier in the national warehouse. Hercules cunningly smiled this private property. So with a sly smile, Hercules continued, "We make a fee for the right to show their wealth and take money from visitors for entrance, so that the museum became not just a repository." A quiet voice came behind his back, so it is Hercules shuddered and returned to him. "Stood a demon." She smiled and boldly added, "Women not interested." Deckhole suggested that Caroline, as all people, had not yet learned to appreciate art, so suggested a boy to use something easier. Hercules hesitated. Deciding not to delve into this topic, they went to the next place. With the second benchmark became a street market where Hercules often visited. Walking between the trading rows of Caroline, fascinated around it, was surprised how lively this place was, selling the baking of the spice of jewel. Even in a time when Lemuria owned 2/3 of the world wealth, the market remained the main focus of trade. That is why Hercules decided to build a museum nearby, so people visiting the exhibitions at the same time came to the market by buying goods. Here worked, and artisans who could make a souvenir with any name and date of Caroline realized that all this lively atmosphere was the result of Hercules' reforms. In the meantime, he was looking at jewelry and suddenly lifted one necklace. The girl was surprised to look at him. Hercules carefully looked at her and said, "Your eyes similar to ruby." "No, they even wonderful," nervously. "You smiled me, flattened me. If you like something, you like something." Caroline swung his hands too much. Her cheeks raised and looked down. She grew up in Galino's family to her father's martial art. The guy was in surprise to tilted his head. "So you don't want a reward from the emperor?" Caroline stopped. She not wanted his insulting Hercules, just laughed, then just accept it. "I am not like an emperor, but just how I want to give it to you." Hercules calmly said that Caroline is beautiful and that she will look good in anything. The girl again turned the blushing again from me again, murmured. "She's a guy," just smiled and nodded careless. There were some interesting options among the pendants, and one particularly attracted her attention. By Hercules noticed it, and asked if she liked something. Caroline quickly turned going to go. "No, I like nothing." A guy just shook his head. He already knew what to do next, and decided that Aqueduct is not the best place for their next stop. So he brought her to the other noisy place of the arena where there were races on the chariots. As soon as Caroline saw the arena, her eyes lit up with the grip. She exclaimed she had long dreamed to see the real races on the chariots. Hercules happy smiled. He knew what she would like it. Race is a check of confidence between the rider and his horse has been passionate about. She said here, a horse competing with a horse with a man, and all this is a real fight of speed. Caroline was sure there is no person, anybody like this sight. She was particularly interested in one jockey, Red Comet. "Shanini is just incredible." She said she was one of the most popular riders who won many competitions from the very beginning of his career. After completing the race, Shanini stopped his horses, and turning to the crowd waved by the audience with his hand. Caroline smiled and said similarly, "Today's races is officially completed." At this point, the sound of anthem. Caroline was surprised to look around, and saw that her father Galf was in his hands. In his hands, he kept a fabric scarf with a military, silently lifted it, and then threw it sharply to the ground, sharply. On a signal from the gate of the arena at the same time jumped 2 carts harnessed by the horses of Caroline in surprise. She did not understand what happened. Why did they decide to spend 2 arrivals at the same time? She was convinced that in the arena only one Gawarkul smiled. We added the second gate during the reconstruction of the stadium. Once upon a time, this stadium experienced serious financial difficulties, and the lack of proper care only worsened the situation. So they decided not only to repair it, but also to completely rebuild it using a more modern design. Understanding and updating it turned out to be simpler and favorable. Caroline suddenly pointed to the arena where the Red Comet of Shananay crowd was screaming his name, calling, not losing the girl. She couldn't believe that he did not even think about it. But when he saw her shining happy face, then suddenly felt a strange excitement to take a look away. The guy smiled thoughtfully. When the race ended and Caroline, with a joyful exclamation, jumped from the stairs without hiding her admiration. She couldn't believe that the Red Comet decided to take the risk at the last moment. He fully justified all her hopes. Hercules crossed her arms on his chest. "By the way, you forgot about me already in half the race crop language." Realized that he was right. She was blinding her head with a confusion. Already dried, but Hercules suggested that she visit another locality, interestedly tilted her head. "Last place?" The guy confidently nodded. "So we go to Sailorskin Froze." "See?" She looked at him as if he had just suggested that she jumped into a river in a ribbon. "This is a classic place for walks and dates. The sea is a place where all the sewer waters of Lemuria flock. It stinks dirty and just disgusting." Hercules thoughtfully sighed. So this place that people chose for romantic dates in another world. He flashed in his mind. He nodded stubbornly. "Will be a good one." Then she had time to deny. The guy easily pushed her forward. Caroline, anticipating a terrible stench, covered the nose. But Hercules calmly said, "We arrived." Carefully opened eyes. In front of her, a fairy tale landscape was. A high breakdown made it possible to see the sea in all its greatness. The sun was reflected in the waves and the water looked crystal pure. Caroline struck by this beauty. Going down to the harbor herself, she was even more surprised. Here was no garbage, and the water remained transparent and did not stink once the coast was littered with fish waste. But now it was impossible to recognize the Hercules, watching her reaction, just smiling at all because of the law. Once all the wastewater and waste of the new Lemuria were uncontrollably dropped into the sea, which caused not only stench, but also outbreaks. He explained that all wastewater now passed through a series of filters before getting into the sea. He also adopted a law on combating garbage, and planned to create a new state position responsible for the removal and disposal of waste, so that the capital would not be clogged. All the garbage from now on, exported beyond its borders, could not believe that Hercules made so much effort to solve this problem. Asked, she nodded absolutely. He slowly approached her gently, hugging her shoulders and gently kissing his forehead. Because if I am going to go on a date with that who I like, with a smile, said it would be a good look if the city looked pure. Caroline froze, her cheeks instantly flash. She did not even notice how Hercules almost imperceptibly hung her neck the same pendant on which she looked earlier. The stone blew perfectly with your red hair, he said, watching her reaction. Their views met Hercules calmly. He added to you a very passionate shock, full of shock and joy, smiled at him in response to her heart. And his voice was heard softly. Hercules smiled and gently said, I would like and you make the same. Sammy. Caroline blinking, not understanding what he is in mind. Just kiss me in the cheek as a sign of gratitude. He explained, fun watching her face, instantly poured rumionets with so much effort to make the sea again beautiful to the same. Caroline said that he would do everything he would ask. The girl was shocked. While she was ashamed and red, Hercules thought he did not want to force her. But it is not interesting to ask her for a kiss. But before he managed to say something, another Caroline strongly put his arms on his shoulders and quickly kissed him in the cheek. You worked well, said Wayne. Hercules was surprised but quickly recovered, and answered her gentle gesture. He grabbed her for his waist and then dragged his sag. Got hot. Hercules angrily twisted and mentally ordered her silent. They just stood together silently looking at the sea. Meanwhile, in the palace, Patriarch postponed the documents and asked, by the way, I did not see His Majesty today. He was busy? Smiling. He thought it was good to have someone who could be genuinely interested in Caroline to heard this nervously coughing, clearly embarrassed man, who initially did not show any initiative in his duties, but just evaded the work, now working without putting his hands, thoughtfully saying a little. After all, the war could begin soon. While the palace disassembled military reports, and the cards of Hercules showed Caroline beauty of nature. Meanwhile, some suspicious activity was recorded on the island, but the evidence was not enough. But it was impossible to leave the situation unattended until it was delayed. Hercules and Caroline's father decided to discuss it with His Majesty. I first talked to him, said Christopher's wise man, sarcastically grunting the military. Obidwa looked angrily at each other, but finally opened the door to Hercules at the same time. The fact that they saw them froze before they sat red with Caroline, and on her knees quietly reading the book lay Hercules after their views. The girl swore and asked, you uncomfortable? Not inconvenient to read sitting? Christopher and Galf were stunned by scene and in one voice exclaimed, Your Majesty! Caroline shuddered when her father was standing in the door. Hercules, despite their reaction, calmly postponed the book and put his head on his knees. So you want to enlarge the army? Windhovic men asked at the same time, nodding from the fleet, said Christopher. But also the land army should be strengthened in the first place. Again, they looked at clearly from their proposals. Hercules breathed sharply and rushed to the Caroline's office, muttering, These old people scaring me. But the jokes had to postpone the last year, most of the increased profits. The empire spent on state-owned land irrigation reports, the restoration of military roads, launch aqueducts to improve the healthcare system, etc. If they do not strengthen the economic foundation of the country, the raising of the morale among the population was of great importance. But Hercules predicted an increase in the military budget at the beginning of the reign. There was one problem. He strictly looked at the audience of the country of this country as too weak and disorganized that it could be revived by one order. Regardless of the peace treaty between different races, any party could easily break it and start accumulating resources for war. He understood the need to strengthen the troops, but the current army was too weak to become a reliable shield of the empire. Christopher wanted to deny, but instead said, recently we noticed amazing activity on the outskirts of Hercules even without hesitation. Suggested that the peninsula is true? I already know about it. Suspicious and unregistered wheat and cast iron operations were also confirmed by merchants and mediators from different countries. Reported an abnormal increase in the number of mercenaries arrived in the regional service with a thorough investigation and traced all the threads. They led to the peninsula. Circular was convinced that the rulers of Persona thought as if the country was led by a young emperor. Would be easy to believe that they would be able to destroy the Lemuria as their vanity and ignorance of the situation sits on the throne. It was obvious that sooner or later on, Lemuria would be attacked in such a situation. To expand the weak and disorganized army without general reform would be a waste of money in a vain. A sigh of the money, a sigh of Hercules thought out aloud, it is really difficult. Suddenly Caroline decided to intervene, and that if the army of Lemuria becomes strong, Galf jumped sharply by turning to Christopher. "Well said," he exclaimed, then turning to Hercules, I added, "I promise that you will not regret if you support us." Emperor Nod immediately call a strategic conference. This is what Galf expected from his daughter. Chrysostopher only dry, said it was still obvious. After financial reform in the state treasury, there is enough money to sell military projects. At the moment, the Lemurian Empire had about 20,000 heavy cavalry and archers with long meadows as well. Hercules asked how many reinforcements they need. Galf, a little thinking of the cavalry, we have enough, but I still don't feel calm about the common combat force. We need at least 10,000 infantrymen. If we could afford more than 20,000, it would be the perfect variant to cut it sharply, not to ask for me more than we can let ourselves. Let me look at Christopher, what we had with the fleet. Christopher was satisfied with the current state of the fleet, but many ships were on the verge of their capabilities and needed to recover. As we reduce the cost of land troops, we can significantly strengthen the control of the sea, or at least preserve the current level of naval power. He turned to Hercules and reminded we did not participate in any major naval battle for almost 20 years. And now suddenly we want to challenge the army of his uncle. Skeptically glanced at him and indignantly turned something under his nose. "And what do you melt?" he exclaimed Galfo by breaking into a cry. "If we lose control of the sea, then we will not be able to protect even the capital." He insisted that the fleet should be the main priority. In the same time, Galf demanded a strengthening of land troops. Their dispute was not groundless. Army really needed more attention and financing. The military forces of the Lemurian Empire were divided into two parts. The army was under the command of Galf, a navy under the direction of Christopher. The main troops were well trained and able to adapt to any battlefield, that precisely the empire of carrying out active conquests. But after the collapse of the state, military power began to decline when Adrien III's army came down to the throne to a critical level. He disbanded the whole infantry and relied on heavy cavalry and archers. These troops were less flexible but effective in battle. He believed that the army would become more mobile and would respond more quickly to threats. At that moment, half the troops consisted of peasants and the other half of the mercenaries of the Union tribes. But the soldiers who kept the plow yesterday could not fight on the professional armies of Adrien III, lost troops one by one, and while the recruits were skilled by the army. Meanwhile, huge funds went to buy expensive horses and equipment for cavalry. Eventually the empire was stuck in financial problems, which led to a catastrophic state. Caroline thought, if she turned to him, if a recruitment, mercenaries are soldiers who are fighting only for money. Even the Spanish Habsburgs, who owned huge colonies in South America and rich in silver, spent all the resources on the maintenance. Due to the absence of a regular army and dependence on mercenaries, many countries have suffered betrayal. And the Italian philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli opposed the use of hired troops, believing that they cannot be trusted. At the same time, Turia successfully moved from the hired army to a regular, unlike French reinforcement. However, not all mercenaries were unreliable. For example, Swiss mercenaries remained faithful to France until death. French national troops during the Revolution also switched to the side of the citizens. In this way, to prove that all mercenaries act with evil intentions, impossible. Machiavelli, who had no military experience in the Introduction Empire, so he decided to focus on strengthening the regular army of Galfe, fully supported this decision, having not relied on mercenaries. Christopher, who was silent before, finally stood up and said coldly, by most mercenaries in the fleet even not being able to ride that to lead the marine battle. Galf was squeezed out. Aha, but your ships turned into a bunch of rot. Hercules raised his hand, interrupting them. If you do not stop, then I will make you kiss, and it will be an imperial order. Two men at the same time groaned and jumped silently, lowered the head of the Hercules, satisfiedly nodded. Here and well, smart guys. He explained that it is not going to reduce the financing of the fleet. If we lose control of the sea, it would be extremely difficult to say. It was hardly said by the emperor to accelerate the construction. As for the land army, Hercules acknowledged that finding 10,000 new soldiers, he will not be able to gain 3,000 quite real. Way will be sufficiently answered by Galfe. The main problem is 30,000 Unteroffiziers of the regular army. Hercules looked at him in a question of 30,000 soldiers. Hercules smiled and nodded. Then I leave it. Toba. Christopher coughed up and said, Until we talk here, guys from Persona can become a bigger problem for us. 8 years ago, the core of maniacs rebelled against their ruler of the imperative. They captured and robbed the peninsula that led to chaos in the region. They knew that the ruler was betting on a heavy cavalry and would not be able to effectively withstand the light infantry. And now, the same mercenaries who once destroyed their homeland could be a threat to Lemuria. Hercules thought it would be possible to use their tactics. Caroline thought about the words of Hercules. Or did he mean that they would attack the personality themselves? He thought, and then offered something to Hercules. He listened carefully and nodded by agreeing with the plan. Meanwhile, a deep night in the next kingdom, in one of the rooms, quietly came a man in the dark cloak of 2 elves standing in the room. At once, Lo bowed to him. The man grabbed one of them by his shoulder with his big hand, and smiling in the proverb, the king looked away and asked for his subordinate. "We have already managed to gather?" A warrior answered, 10,000 mercenaries among 5,000 infantrymen, and 5,000 crossbows at our disposal of another 30,000 infantrymen, and 5,000 cavalry from different tribes, so a total of 45,000 soldiers. The king smiled ominously. At this point, Hercules viewed the documents in his office. He carefully studied the information, and finally the predictive Black Panther Dali, muddy warlord with a cold look, dark hair, and a formidable smile. He kept in his hands a frightened little Elfian, squeezing her for his waist like a toy. The next day in Lemuria was warm and sunny, and the castle was dominated by Tishapatriarch, carrying a stack of scrolls in his hands, accidentally looking from the balcony to the yard, and saw something interesting. Hercules and Caroline trained in battle. Their faces were focused on the swords of the swords. Hercule launched papers, carefully reviewing the strategic document. Christopher presented him with reports on the state of army formation and schedules of construction of ships that should be completed before. Given the growing inflow of wheat and iron to the person, it was clear that the enemy was actively preparing. They also began to collect, massively gathering soldiers, but they would take a long time to prepare for an open war. Hercules nodded. Our troops well trained, but not only we need to restore the fleet, but also to collect as many soldiers as possible. After a military strategic meeting in Lemuria, all military artisans and engineers were alarming alarm immediately. Everyone started working in the preparation for the battle. Meanwhile, a large warship approached the harbor. One of the officers appealed to Christopher. "We gathered all the galleys, Your Majesty." However, the sailboats moved too slowly. Masts had to sharpen and increase the speed, and the real battle of the ship would be loaded with armor and weapons. So its maneuverability will even be more reduced by the paddles from the right side paddled harder than others, which led to the unbalance of the ship. At the military training ground, the soldiers were intensively preparing for the fighting. One of the soldiers was rejected back and fell directly at the feet of the allied man, who knocked him down loudly with, "You that happened to you? Are you not going to be afraid of it?" He angrily looked at the warriors. "How are you going to defend the empire with such weakness? Our enemies of the barbarians have selected our lands. How can you fear them and retreat?" Soldier stopped and added sharply, "To imagine yourself with a general of the enemy army, and now attack me with the intention of killing." At this moment, in order to lift the morale and the power of the warriors, Hercules himself gave up with a grueling training with Caroline. He focusedly worked the strikes with a sword, demonstrating everything that the real emperor should be, not only a strategist, but also a warrior. Hercules expected a strong opposition from the daughter of a glorious knightly kind, but even he was impressed with no gaps in her protection. Caroline, not just a knight, she was a supreme knight. She seriously attacked her sword in the air. "A true knight always keeps a cold mind. Panic path to defeat," added Karena. Hercules smiled as expected from Galagon's daughter. Carsili, that watched their clash, decided to intervene, jumped from the canopy of the building, quite unexpectedly attacking Caroline. At the moment of stroke, he used his innate magic of strengthening the body, significantly increasing his speed and strength. Caroline instantly reacted by exposing the sword for lock. But from a powerful shock, the blade split in half. She did not express fear, only a sober calculation. But now she would do now? In response, Caroline activated her own innate magic, extraordinary speed. After a stroke, she made a sharp downward forward and her fist hit Hercules directly in the face. The amazed and disoriented guy was barely able to understand that the Caroline was lightning for his clothes on the ground, and put a fragment of a sword in his gorlane, and he so self-confident. Hercules smiled, recognizing her preference. The girl shone from joy and said that His Majesty was also wonderful, that the hero had a talent for sword possession. But Hercules only shrugged that he could make no more than any other man. He did not consider himself a special carousel. Elves had 3 unique abilities: This witchcraft magic and spiritual art of witchcraft was a gift that allowed the world to understand more deep. Magic could seem similar to witchcraft, but had a completely different nature of sorcery, due to complex calculations and pronunciation. So it was not suitable for battle. Instead, magic created for battles can be used without delay. But not everyone, even after long training, had a tendency for it. Magic was divided into three main categories. First, innate magic, such as Caroline's extraordinary speed that allowed her to move several times faster than ordinary people. The second, magic of ancestors, was transmitted only through a bloodline. For example, the Galinos family believed that their swords were created for the emperor in their hands. Any item became a deadly weapon. Even a regular fork could punch armor. The third, hereditary magic, that was passed from generation to generation from the emperors of the Limmer, was a symbol of power and continuity. Thanks to this force, the emperors could influence the consciousness of other elves that played an important role in politics, in particular, when discussing financial reforms with nobles. And finally, the spiritual art of technology that allowed contracts with spirits and used their strength of the spirits, symbolized the nature and energy of the world. And thanks to the concluded contract, people could get a share of their power. Everyone who had a contract with a spirit could use his forces, so such abilities were highly valued in rural areas by spirits, helped to predict the weather. But their services were not free for every use of their strength. However, the Hercules Treaty was another. His spirit was a source of magical power, but did not help in the battle. The hero just smiled, and said that it was not excited because he was glad that Caroline was not injured. In surprise, looked at his smile, in surprise. Hercules stretched her hand, asking to help to get up, but as soon as Caroline took him by the hand, he suddenly pulled her to him, forcing her to get lost. He smiled, and asked if it was not a wonderful moment to use her extreme speed. Noticing that Caroline tries to keep calm, hero decided to mock her slightly from her. He leaned even closer to him. That tired, her arms girl shouted in, demanding to stop these jokes. Hercules just smiling her hair, and noticed that she was too easily embarrassed. Caroline instinctively covered her eyes, and the guy noticed as a familiar pendant glittered on her neck. He recognized a gift that once gave her, and thought of grabbing her hand. He slowly leaned closer to her lips, and Caroline continued to lie with her eyes closed. But at this moment, the romantic atmosphere was destroyed by the patriarch, who smiled out of the upper balcony loud. Caroline shuddered from surprise, but Hercules only angrily asked patriarch what he wanted. He smiled, and reported that his majesty caused Titus. Achilles was surprised when he heard his older brother. Meanwhile, Titus, working in the workshop, annoyedly grunting that his brother had to wait 10 minutes for 10 precious minutes to wait. He considered it unbearable, and thought that his majesty could show more respect for his older brother. When Hercules finally came, he had to listen to a wave of indignation. Titus was angry because he could not focus on work when someone was waiting. But unlike other people who wasted time in anticipation of Hercules, was not going to change. He believed that such as his brother lived art, and such as he only flirt with girls. Hercules just smiled and replied that if Titus considers him an ordinary man, he even booked a place at his next exhibition. Titus invited him to sit down while cooking coffee, but asked to avoid one special chair. It was a damn chair with a favorite place of the executed serial murderer for legend. Everyone who sat on him risked being killed by the spirit of the dead, said that this chair caused death more than 50 people. Titus considered it a creepy. Hercules, that it was a legendary peer, unexpectedly agreed with his idea. Titus was the second son in the Adrien's family, and his elder brother of the second prince of the Lemurian Empire. Was not a closeness between them, because they were erected brothers and grew separately. But they were united by art, so they often communicated, although Hercules remained only a lover. Hercules asked about the state of Emperor Adrien. Titus, that he had not yet come into place with the fact that the throne did not reach him. Hercules thought, or not to give a crown, but Titus smiling at him. If he made it, kingdom would come to the end of. Hercules asked whether Titus did not want a crown, but he just waved his hand. Calling it a bad joke, he considered himself a person of art, opened a gallery to create an exhibition space, and even experiment with a little one. Titus had grand plans to finish the sculpture, to draw a few paintings, and then prepare a scene for the future concert. He burst out inspiration, but he lacked his hands. He even joked about the idea of cloning Hercules, smiling that his brother was very similar to Hazen when Titus asked who was thinking. At the heart of Hercules hoped that Adrien would still become an emperor before they dispersed. Titus threw on him an angry gaze. Hercules was convinced that Adrien hated him. Drinking a coffee sip, Titus noted that this situation has no simple solution to Adrien was the firstborn of his father. But upbringing played an evil joke with him. The second son of the family, Titus III Adrien. It was easy to guess Adriana in honor of his father, if he took the throne, would become Adrien IV, so he was named so with the hope that he would fulfill his father's dream. He pamped Adrien too, and he grew up his selfish detached from the real world. As for Titus, he did not always use his privileges for his childhood. He attacked the children of aristocrats, and brutally dealt with his father every time to apologize to the injured families to get a scandal. However, the real cause of all this was their father Titus, that he just hoped that the situation would change over time, but that never happened. A few years ago, Adrien attacked 4 children of noble families. Because of this incident, the whole empire stirred up. But Adrien himself remained indifferent, believing that his father would always find a way out. But this time was different. In the end, the father turned away from him and just gave up. Titus emphasized that his father was always a determined person after he first approached him at his drawings and asked about progress, but looked at them only through anything worthy, and never came to Hercules again that he probably had a title and his father. The desperate was born another son. It was Hercules. He came into the world at the right moment, and from childhood he was perfect for his father. He was a real miracle. All the love of other children got Hercules. Adrien was forgotten, and that is why he hated him with a carelessly smiling and called it a happy finale. Hercules, struck by his calmness, that it was in this story that it was so pleased. Father was a terrible caregiver. But Titus denied that Hercules was proof of his success. He avoided the mistakes of which made the first 2 sons descendants of royal families this creation formed, through the bitter experience of previous generations. Coffee, and gently thanked the brother for these words. Titus asked when His Majesty finally gets rid of Adrien, because no one knows when the elderly brother would decide to be deprived of him. But Hercules replied that Adrien behaved calmly, he would not touch him. But Titus did not believe that his brother would stay out of the Psyche or unite. Hercules looked gloomily at his brother, and noted that he was not at all versed in politics to imagine the rebellion was impossible to move goods, and people were fully controlled through guilds, and the attack was also unrealistic. And even if Adrien really dares to kill him quickly, arrest or eliminate Titus, nervously laughed by saying that his brother says horrible things. Hercules mentioned something important, and asked Titus whether he made his request, looked at the suitcase that lay on the side and said with a smile that it was the reason for his call. Hercules opened it and looked inside. On his face appeared a blush of happiness. He said that it was what he was waiting for, and that the thing was the perfect brother of rejoicing. Heard such praise, Hercules did not resist, and asked where Titus got this project. Titus explained what he did exactly as it was stated in the order, and asked if everything suited His Majesty. Hercules nodded, noting that it looks just a great tit. That the hero intended to give a thing Caroline after a successful military reform, because he would not know it. As soon as he was going to answer, as a knocked door knocked. Christopher entered the room by apologizing to the prince and His Majesty. He reported that the preparation of 30,000 infantrymen and younger officers was completed by the fleet was also restored, and the number of capable ships reached a maximum of. Titus immediately realized. Hercules strongly stated that they would return to their peninsula Persian from that moment the war begins. Persian territory that initially belonged to the Empire of Lemuria, its main income came from exports of grapes, of olives and marble, but these profits were clear. 8 years ago, when Heracles was just 4 mercenaries broke into the territory because of the decision of his predecessor Adrien stopped paying them money under the contract to suppress the uprising. Adrien himself headed the army and began the war, but suffered a devastating defeat from the troops of Dalios. Since then, Personia has become virtually an independent state that was governed by mercenaries. They have suppressed the population and established a cruel regime headed by Tyrandaios. This night in the Gulf of Personia Sea was calm, moonlight gently gleaming on its surface. The guy sitting in the dark drank his drink, admiring the night landscape. But suddenly silence broke, a sharp noise that came from windows. In the air, the explosions of guns were heard, and from the coast to the city in a panic fled the guard on the guard tower, loudly commanded everyone to take combat positions and immediately prepare for the attack. The whole horizon at sea was filled with enemy ships that were constantly moving to the city. In the city, people covered with despair sitting near the walls of buildings. Lowering their heads past a soldier, and a little boy trembling tried to stop a good time, asking to spare. But a soldier, even looking at him silently, struck the baby on his head, silently. Meanwhile, in the luxurious castle that was in an enemy camp took place a royal dinner on the table, steamed, just-cooked meat. King holding in his hands a note brought by his servants to briefly revised it in. It was a request to reduce taxes because the country was covered by poverty. He only scornfully rapped they were free from Lemuri control, but quickly spent all the money. King disrespectfully thought that these people would not survive without him, and reject the note. Took a glass with wine. After taking a sip, he smiled. Noting the wine here, the wonderful food was better than in Lemur at this moment, that the commander approached the clerk and reported that the movement of the troops of the Lemuria Empire they liked. They were preparing for the invasion of the king, just smiling calmly, and said that it was known for a long time. One of the courtiers asked the commander whether they really planned to fight with Lemuria, but he just dispersed. There was no reason to excite. Their enemy was a 15-year-old guy who never participated in the war. But more, he was a descendant, smiled, lifted his glass, and stated that the first battle would become an unforgettable boy. But suddenly the door with a roar opened. Balger shouting that there were bad news. The commander did not even ask what happened. He had grabbed a soldier for his head and struck it with all power on the table. The commander was angry that the soldier interrupted his meal. Now he would not be able to enjoy the food, of which the soldier's face crashed at the plate. However, he still found the strength to inform that a letter received with confirmation of the army of the Lemurian Empire had already entered their territory. Two maids frightened, and the commander looked at the soldier with surprise. In the next moment, he was sharply grabbing on his feet, angry with a halt, waving everything from the table. His voice heard all over the hall. He demanded explanations that the devil is taking away here. The enemy attacked unexpectedly, but the commander was not a fool. He asked what direction the invasion began. Then someone exclaimed that Personia fell under the pressure of the Lemurian Empire's army. Heard that commander exploded with a mocking laughter, calling Hercules little rat. He realized that Hercules knew in advance that there was no military fleet in Personia in Persian. The chief ordered to mobilize the troops immediately. If the enemy is already in the Gulf of Persian, then he has two options: or move to the fortress where the commander was currently located, or to go to the capital. He understood that the army would have to go a long way of heavy armor, depleted the soldiers, and the long march depletes even more. And Hercules, unlike Adrien III, had an analytical mind and hardly take a careless step in such an important battle. If he wants to win, then go to the capital. But the commander just smiled, as a naive step of them protected 1,000 mercenaries brought up in harsh conditions from childhood and 20 selected archers, in addition. But while the commander was thinking about his soldier, his voice ran for him full of panic. The head wall of the capital was destroyed, and the Lemuria army had already broken inside. The commander could not believe his defense was perfect. Lemuria did not have such a strong army. But he did not take into account the most important in the city itself. Began a riot. His eyes were staring at the map, and in his head was a terrible thought. Among them were traitors possible, even traitors. In the city, the uprising was raging. People attacked servants by shouting the demands for tyrants to flee from their earth. They did not want to die from excessive taxes. While the aristocrats enjoy the feasts at their expense, soldiers tried to quench the crowd. People began to shout even louder, declaring that they would better transfer their lands to Lemuri than living in this hell. They demanded that the military immediately leave the city in fury. One of the soldiers grabbed his sword, and without hesitation, struck the rider that stood in front of him. He had inserted a blade several times until he fell to the ground. At the same time, another soldier approached the gate of the castle and ordered them to open for the imperial army. Hercules, standing at a distance and watching the city, only smiling. He was sure that the panther saw it all, not enough like an apple near the apple tree falls, but it would be like an apple to him, which with all the scope of his bullite was a very squeezed. The invasion went so smoothly for Hercules, the answer was obvious. He explained that the question was not in military force, but in the money. Further assembled his army from the mercenaries of the raised in harsh conditions they were given to him because he was fed them. But it was not enough to keep control of all cities, so he was forced to hire additional troops. Therefore, they first lured the mercenaries on their side, offered them twice as much salary of Hercules planned 3 months ago. Afterwards, a gloomy look at His Majesty called him a bribery, and asked who could still talk about loyal. When the bribe of mercenaries penetrated the city, they helped raise the uprising among the cities of Caroline. In surprise, looked at Christopher without believing that they were able to organize such a revolution relying only on locals. But everything was just people hated for a long time. Flames, but to lure them to their side, took a long time, and now they have finally opened the gate. The success of this invasion became obvious 3 months ago. Now Hercules was sure that he could meet with Dalios on a better battlefield. His gaze stopped at Caroline's father, who obviously wanted to say something. He noted that for His Majesty it is the first war he commanded by now. All the orders of Hercules were perfect, but this success was bordered with miracle, and now they must keep this advantage as long as possible. Achilles skeptically smiled as the imperial army general suggested to defend himself in the eyes of his daughter. For him it was a manifestation of weakness. The general glanced at the emperor, but Hercules calmly replied that they had a great chance of winning them. Peninsula Personia belonged to the empire for the last 8 years. Based on the information obtained from the merchants, Hercules concluded that the geography of the region remained unchanged, but the general warned that they could encounter a trap of Gallios. Hercules smiling at him and stretched out the wrapped paper. It was a map of Persian Persanius, which he accidentally found falling asleep in the library of the castle. Comparing it with the trader data, he found that most of the details coincide. He confidently poked his finger on the map, stating that 2 days later, the last city was attacking this city by trying to get it. Hercules proposed to start the attack from the height of archers would take positions on the hill, and on the other hand, it would protect the river. It would defend only the front and the rear. He ordered the troops to be stored for additional protection. He appealed to General, asking to calm down and not comparing him with his father when he was just 4 years old. His father first took him on the battlefield, then he was already forced to wear heavy armor. After the many battles, he learned the art of retreating. Though the terrible ruler twice in a row won the Hercules Empire, that he would not be able to defeat him with the power of his hands alone. He smiled at the general and assured that he always listened to his though. He asked His Majesty to entrust him victory in this war, by promising to bring further to his feet that would not cost. Hercules smiled in Galphy, calling him a stormy fire, and said that the general was counting on him in response to it. Smiled to the emperor and nodded confidently. Sitting in the middle of the dark night in his room, the guy thought of a rapid attack in the bay and the rapid capture of the capital. As the Galphy was predicting, everything was clearly planned. Further, apparently now was in a panic. But this chaos gave them the opportunity to complete all the preparation of. Christopher was busy strengthening the defense of the bay in 2 days. The final battle of their army, which doubled at the expense of new forces, was ready to show their power. While Hercules plunged into his thoughts, a demon flew that the guy was still asleep. She advised him to lie down to rest, otherwise she would be forced to intervene. The streets of the city were heard by hundreds of soldiers. General Panther ordered them to move faster. He was no longer about to dance to the melody. In his anger, Dalios already spoke of the murder of Hercules. Without drawing his gaze from the window reflected what step he would take his opponent, he did not even notice how the demon hugged him. One of the classical strategy rules shows that the attacking side must have 3 times more strength to defeat the enemy that is defended. That protection is more favorable position. But the attacking side has the freedom of choosing time and place of impact, and this gives the advantage in the initiative. Marculus suggested that they should attack strategically, defend themselves tactically, and win this perfect balance. For Curline's victory did not understand his words, and asked whether the enemies would still take the initiative. But Marculus explained that both defenders and attackers can control the battlefield if they calculate their actions correctly. Hercules smiled, saying that their situation is unique. They seem to be protected and not attack, but he will allow the enemy to take the first step. The reign of Davos made him hated for the people. He kept everything in fear. But it became weak as soon as the mercenaries realized that the war was lost, and no one will help them, throw him and run away, saving their own life. Caroline asked why they just won't unite around their leader. Hercules gently stroked her on the head, explaining that mercenaries were not an army committed to their country. For them war this business. They will not go to the right death for the sake of loyalty of Caroline. Hercules knew that the next one wanted to crush him as soon. The guards brought urgent news in the field. Enemy soldiers came in front. Hercules watched the field by mentioning the merchants who conveyed to him important information. Now all that they said confirmed. General pointed a finger on the flag depicting a black panther. Hercules also noticed it. Further, the terrible general headed his army by moving ahead. The front line consisted of 28,000 mercy. Hercules was satisfied that the intelligence received from the bribed mercenaries fully coincided with the reality of the total enemy. Had 8,000 cavalrymen, 15,000 infantrymen, and 5,000 archers in total, 28,000 well-armed soldiers. Hercules' troops were numerically smaller, their total number equal to the hostile infantry. But they had a significant advantage in the defense of the fortified positions of the trenches and rows of sharpened pegs. If the enemy tries to force the river, then his troops would cover the downpour, as if a storm cracking on the field. Hercules knew that he had no many options. He had only to go straight through the trap, hoping for a breakthrough. But if the enemy chooses this path, the decisive role is played. His voice was heard over the battlefield, calling everyone to return their land in response to the soldiers shouted their battle spirit. General Panther, standing from afar with hatred, looked at Hercules. He grabbed the sword, lifting him high above himself, and fiercely exclaimed. He sharply lowered the sword, and the enemy army rushed to the attack by Hercules' soldiers immediately raised alarm, warning the offensive. Hercules loudly ordered the archers to prepare. In the next moment, arrows flew into the sky and covered the enemy with deadly rain. Magi, who possessed the art of challenge, turned to the spirit of the worn being. Tanning among the flying arrows in the air, began to appear huge butterflies flickering between strokes. They merged with arrows flying with them. Just in hostile rows of hundreds of soldiers fell dead. One of the elf-igners watched the battle without surprise. He has repeatedly seen such tactics. The enemy tried to defend himself, but the elves were famous for their shooting abilities. They could let down 10 arrows. The hostile archers could not punch armor just as effectively as the Lemurians. But if 1,000 arrows flies into open areas of the body, then even without serious injuries, every 2 minutes leave 1,000 fighters, and in 10 minutes 5,000 soldiers or die or become inadvertent. Arrows poured continuously by destroying the enemy's morale. Soldiers for help. Many began to retreat with supporting wounded comrades. They did not want to die so foolish. One of the soldiers who carried his wounded friend realized that he was already dead. He was forced to leave his body, but when retreating came across his generation, covered them with fear. Further, the fierce mode fiercely pushed on them. His anger, he stated that he would not allow his money to be lost in vain. His gaze forced the fighters to tremble. They had no choice. They had to go back on the attack. Hercules coldly watched it and said those who rushed to them again died regardless of their choice. The enemy was holding much better than Hercules expected. They were able to break closer to his archers. Hero realized that the moment had come for a decisive blow and ordered to call Galfi. Elapsizoctia in heavy armor seemed giant going out to Hercules. He solemnly stated that it was time to go into battle. Hercules pointed his finger at enemy troops and ordered him to take command of a detachment of heavy cavalry and immediately attack. The soldiers were surprised by this order and tried to deny the cavalry through the heavy armor. Hercules whistled. His eyes asked whether he was sure of this, but Alpus only smiled and proudly replied, "Who do you think? Grabbing the huge spear of Galfi, shouted to his warriors. The order to follow him had to follow no matter what he urged them to show the enemy fruits. General shouted to the archers to retreat to not interfere with the offensive of the cavalry. Meanwhile, Hercules carefully counted the distance between the cavalry and the enemy, waiting for the perfect moment for action. The enemy warriors saw a heavy cavalry that the approaching could not believe their eyes. Did they hesitate, or was it a serious maneuver? They thought the cavalry would try to break through the fortification, but it looked senseless. Tefertherio was convinced that they overestimate their horses and armor. But he did not risk and ordered immediately to recall some of the soldiers. When the distance between the troops reached the 10-meter mark, Hercules finally gave a signal, "Act now!" He ordered his spirit to the devil of Moody to abolish the illusion. The devil undoubtedly fulfilled the order of his master. In an instant, the barrier between the troops disappeared, leaving enemy soldiers in absolute shock. Galfi saw it, loudly shouted Caroline that His Majesty eliminated the illusion of the girl, instantly understood him. In the next moment, the father and daughter, full of combat passion, shouted at the same time that will destroy enemies and burn all the ground. They caused the spirit of Oligos and Amon's spirit to complete this decisive blow. Caused by Oligos and Amon's spirits, broke into the thickets of a hostile troop. Caroline, together with the spirits, destroyed every enemy who stood in her ways. Her movements were rapid and accurate stroke. She loudly urged the warriors to move forward without stopping for a moment. Enemy infantry unable to resist. They dropped under pressure from the spirits of cavalry and magical attacks. The whole army of Hercules shouted to each other, "The only forward! Only forward!" Watching Grigingles fighting, he could not believe that Hercules so skillfully hid his offensive routes. Using his own unique tactics, it was impossible. How could such a fool be such a brilliant strategist? How could a hawk be born of a snake? Further, on the contrary, he just smiled to him that it would become an interesting sight. He ordered the sergeant to change the strategy. Enemy infantrymen suddenly began to run in different directions. It was embarrassed by the cavalry, and the infantrymen of Hercules did not understand that Hercules himself was happening, also noticed a change in the tactics of the enemy. He felt that behind this lies something more. Caroline warned his father that the behavior of the enemy changed. He only nodded, saying that he noticed it, and ordered her not to lose vigilance. But suddenly, they fell from the sky. From the arrows they flew directly into the heads of the allies. Caroline and her father looked back in horror, seeing their warriors fall from the horses without even shouting. Hostile detachments acted agreed by. They brought forward a unit. Hercules watched the enemy's actions in surprise. General Donos, raising his sword, ordered the crossbows to start an attack. The enemy soldiers lined up in a massive phalanx by pulling the spears, and the shooters prepared for the second volley. Hercules' cavalry realized that it was a trap, but they did not have a choice. Of retreat were impossible. They got the only order not to stop to break forward, but the enemy crossbows had already released the next volley of arrow. When the Hercules cavalry approached the enemies, they put the spears forward by creating a dense line of defense. Every rider approaching too quickly risked to be pierced through. Achilles' archers again prepared for the attack. They screamed enemies that they would not pass, and fired from the minimum distance of arrows fell on opponents, striking them almost close. But enemies were constantly approaching. Caroline felt the fear situation became a critical. Galfo also realized that they gradually losing positions of hostile pressure became getting stronger, and they began to retreat. To Hercules ran up a soldier and reported that the 1st and 3rd detachments broke through. The infantry tried to keep the enemies, but for a long time it could not last herself to give Heracles an order to retreat. But Hercules remained silent. He was well aware that the next one intended to destroy their cavalry using cunning tactics. Initially the enemy divided the central units of the infantry and sent them in different directions, and then put forward the crusaders and the lists. In this way he not only slowed the motion, if then he had time to regroup light cavalry and strengthen the flanks of Hercules would be trapped, but he carefully watched the enemy's movements, analyzing the situation. General Donos was convinced that Hercules did not have a spare plan. He smiled confidently, thinking that the fight would end his victory. But it was at this point that he saw Hercules also smiling, as if he was completely satisfied with the situation. Further thought everything was quietly said. But in his voice, there was no fear of fear or anxiety. He turned to his colonel and calmly asked to bring his horse. In his eyes, there was no doubt. He knew what exactly would be the winner of this battle. Meanwhile, Caroline desperately fought on the battlefield. She felt that her horse was already tired, as she had to find a way to escape from his surround. But it was at that moment that the crossbowman released into her horse an arrow. She fell to the ground, painfully stuck on a solid surface. She did not have time to rise. As before her eyes flashed the edge of the spear. 2 Lisp Bereezers approached, ready to strike a deadly blow. To one of them smiled and asked the other how much they would pay for the head of a hostile commander. However, another soldier hesitated to him. Only a child of his friend laughed that she was not just a girl, but a daughter of a legendary galley of famous as a stormy fire. But before they managed to move away, the head of one of the spears flew into the air. Caroline rubbed blood from the cheek coldly, that such things were too lightly discussed. She could not allow them to disrupt His Majesty's plans by squeezing the sword. She went on attack, by leaving only death. Meanwhile, Hercules sat on his battle horse and confidently ordered the soldiers to follow him, because the moment came to the offensive. All the army headed by Heracles went from the mountain to the enemy Dalios. Believing that Lemuria has only about 10,000 soldiers, was convinced that even additional reinforcements would not change the result of the battle. However, it turned out that the field was lit by warriors. Their number exceeded all expectations. General Donis looked at the enemy army with surprise without realizing where such force came from. Hostile infantrymen were horror. No one expected such pressure. One of the fighters exclaimed that they were not signed up for such conditions and that it was better to retreat. Not paying attention to the voice of Dios, who shouted about the need to stay, soldiers ran into all sides. General Panther immediately ordered to return to positions, explaining that it was just a deception of illusion. But his words disappeared in the buzz of chaotic screams. No one heard his order, clamping his teeth. Caroline noticed that the enemies began to retreat. Watching the soldiers rushed in the run, and voice called them to order. At this point, Heracles reached out to her, silently inviting joining the offensive. Grabbing her hand, he pulled Caroline to himself. When they hugged, she whispered that she was very sorry, but Hercules gently replied that she had handled well in her first battle. Sitting next to His Majesty, Caroline asked him to tell why he hides the number of his soldiers, because she believed that the battle could be completely different if they fought full force. Hercules only nodded, looking at his horseback. Caroline realized that she was in front of her only the illusion of the devil that hung over the soul of the young warrior. Quietly proclaimed that such a mistake requires the proper reward of Hercules reluctantly recognized it, and asked her to disappear. And the devil's spirit smiled at promising to return later. Hercules with a smile noted that he was almost impossible to destroy 40,000 soldiers at one thing. As soon as the enemy loses the will to fight, victory is almost provided. No one else could organize a reliable defense after such a chaotic route, and the result of the battle became obvious. Hercules screamed to the Galfaes that it was time to retreat and return to the base. However, the Galfaes was frightened and doubted Hercules with confidence, saying that Caroline and warriors would be protected to defend his case. Hercules understood the intention of Galfaes, and asked him to make sure that he would not have any threats. He warned the general that he would not overdo. Thus ended the first war under the leadership of Hercules as the emperor of the Lemurian Empire. And this war ended with a full victory after a difficult battle of Hercules' army began to clean the battlefield, to put weapons in boxes to bear the bodies of the dead, and to assist the wounded. Meanwhile, Hercules wrote a military report when Galfay entered him. By opening the entrance to the command tent, he reported that the captive was delivered. Hercules expected an enemy commander to try to resist or show pride, but then the panther was silent that after such a devastating defeat, the remains of his troops simply would not follow him. He had no admissive authority or ancestral heritage to collect the army again. General Dalios lifted his gaze on Hercules and said with the icy rage, "I underestimated you." It was a complete defeat. He suggested to take all the blame for his own defeat. Galfay did not understand how further he dreamed of talking so arrogantly being connected. But Hercules just smiled and calmly said that this time the victory belongs to him. But he asked Dalios what would happen if they came together in an open battle without tactical tricks, and acknowledged that Panther is right. This battle was taught a lot. General suggested that the emperor pass all the captured territories. But in exchange he pleaded to spare him the closest subordinates of those who brought up from the childhood of Galfa. Was shocked by this proposal. Other commanders immediately began to express their indignation. They demanded that these soldiers threatened if they were released, but further suggested a compromise: they could be deported by. These people remained faithful to him until the end of the other soldiers who fought on his side. The empire could do with them all the war. Galfy thought the proposal and eventually agreed to spare these people. But Hercules had one condition, the loss of which the empire cannot be estimated: hundreds of thousands of lives, destroyed cities, lost prestige. All this cannot be compensated simply so. Even if the head of Davos will tear off and give the crowd, it will not change the situation. Then Panther, having narrowed his eyes, asked what Hercules intended to do with him. Hercules smiled and stated that he will become his vassal. All present, all the kerosene stopped, and her father was just amazed. Galfy quickly asked the emperor, or he jokes, but further laughing at acknowledging that it was a truly unusual turn of events, ironically that Hercules offered vassal oath to one who branded his father's shame in history. However, Hercules calmly replied, "He knows how to win." Further, he turned his back to Hercules. "You should not have fun." He said he was a mercenary. He could at any moment release the arrow of Heracles in his back. But the emperor did not even move. He was sure of his decision. Panther asked with a cold confidence, "What will happen if you refuse?" Hercules laughed so loud that he puzzled everyone. Just offered the perfect place in the sun, but did not want to become someone's chain dog. Further and curious, he asked what he meant saying about arrow in his back, addressing General Panther. Suddenly, with a terrible threatening look, he asked Dalios with whom right now talking, that caused tension with all present. Peleos was stunned by incredible magical power, barely breathing in surprise without understanding how such arrogance could accompany such power. Then he imposed a spell on Panther. Caroline was engulfed by severe illness, her raised nausea, and she barely withstanding this condition. Having caught the girl, Hercules seemed to be quietly apologizing gently by hugging her by her shoulders. Even Galfy's hard position is wrapped with his hands on the table. General fell stunned before Heracles, who calmly stated that he does not intend to expel his subordinates, and plans to find fertile land where they can restore their possessions. One of the warriors smiled slightly, and asked the captive whether he is aware of the seriousness of the situation. General fully understood the essence of the case at the moment. He decided to strike an enemy already had time to master it. Hercules approached the general, gently put his hands on his shoulders, and with a slight smile stated that he was counting on their joint cooperation. News about the war and the capture of Personia flew through the city. People in the castle ran through the corridors, crowded with surprise, and immediately organized preparation for the festive feast. In despair, Hercules' older brother smashed a vase with flowers, and there was a man whispering, "If your anger does not calm you even far away." He squeezed his hands without believing that such a small country is capable of real victory. In anger, Adrien stated that he is much better suited to the post of emperor than his brother, and that the time of change has come. The whole city welcomed their emperor, residents rejoiced and eagerly awaited the appearance of Hercules on the city square. It was a triumphant return of the hero throughout the city. The battle calling the brave warriors of the crowd shouted in honor of the emperor, giving him proper respects. It was the award of the winner of Caroline, and Galfi were delighted with applause that was heard in their honor by Hercules, and Carolina waving the locals greeting them in response. Patriarch and other advisors were already waiting for His Majesty to meet him with the friendly smiles. Hercules asked if everything was in order, during his absence of Ant smiling that everyone worked hard. The Patriarch noted that the news about the victory in Personia had already reached the city. All were extremely satisfied with this result. Heracles was not surprised, because this success only reinforced his status, but looked around. He noticed around him. "Where is Adrien?" he asked Tita, because his absence on such an important day looked suspicious. Titus reminded that Adrien did not like to appear in the public. Hercules nodded by agreeing with that. The Patriarch turned his gaze on Galfi and praised him that he had heard a lot of good about his feat. A lapis twirled that he had further decided to miss the amnesty of His Majesty. Christopher jokingly suggested drowning him in the Lemurian Sea. Hercules turned to everyone and smiling, saying that now he could consider further military prey. In addition, he took the vassal oath of the appearance of General Davos scared the audience, and the Patriarch clearly embarrassed the emperor whether he was confident in his decision. But Hercules only nodded in one way or another because of his strategy. Patriarch suggested that he rest after a grueling campaign and join the feast. Hercules realized that he had no urgent cases today, so he accepted an invitation. Aunt smiled and stated that he would bring the best wine to celebrate their first-time victory. Galfi supported him that it was all possible because of His Majesty. Titus even wanted to write a heroic story about him and asked for permission to hear all the details during the banquet. But when everyone turned herald, Patriarch looked in surprise. Where did he go? He was just here. Galfi noticed that, and Caroline disappeared. He was loudly asked if someone saw her, but then smiling thought that maybe the emperor went to receive his reward. Meanwhile, Caroline felt a little embarrassed. She stood wiping a sweat out of the forehead, and turned to His Majesty Zenyaklo, saying that for the first time she put such clothes. She asked whether she really suits her to her. Kaylee smiling at her skirt that Caroline tried to extend shyly. Pulling his hand, "That's perfect," he said. He gave the Caroline clothing of her maid of her hair was neatly collected in a tail, and on her head was a cute hat. She was embarrassed and she tried to look away. But when she saw that His Majesty, it likes her heart filled with warmth. Caroline shuddered from the coolness that she was already cold, and asked if she could finally dress. But Hercules suddenly named her name. Standing on a chair, he seemed not to pay attention to her words that this costume was wonderful after all. He just explained to her why this was so. Caroline understood everything, and blushed even more. Squeezing her teeth, she almost muttered, "I'm a humble maid of my master. I will serve you today." Hercules smiled and praised her for the diligence of Caroline. Felt her ears burning, and she could not believe how at all she was in such a situation. So she really spoke of a reward for the heroism. She was ashamed to even move because it seemed that the skirt was shortened from the slightest movement of Hercules. Smiled and suggested to start with Caroline, taking a look at what exactly he wanted. "Black," answered Hercules, his gaze to a red jar that stood on the top shelf. Caroline nodded and decided to do everything she had already wanted to get a jar. Like Hercules stopped her without magic. She clenched his fists and reached for a shelf. But she was more aware the more she pulled the shorter seam skirt. She realized that she would not be able to get to the jar if she did not release the division. Being on the way, she tried to reach the jar, believing that the remaining a little, but at that moment her skirt rose again. She was proud of the knight of the Lemurian Empire, could not put it before the emperor. She wanted to tell him not to look at, but he watched her look at her. Look one more, and she would reach out. "Don't you perform such a simple order for too long?" With a note of irony asked Hercules. Caroline was confused that he simply cannot reach. "Just jumped, you elf. Or does she really neglect the order only because of fear that the skirt will be taken?" Hercules gave her the best outfit that she can demonstrate her beauty and is her loyalty to the emperor. She remembered how His Majesty was risked for her, And she hesitates just to serve tea? Squeezing her lips, she gathered and decisively jumped, finally got a jar with tea. Landing for a moment, she lost his balance and sat on her knees. Right before Hercules let him see the black lace edge of Caroline for a moment, but made herself standing for herself to stand the emperor's gaze by apologizing, she hurried to say, "I will immediately make tea." Meanwhile, Hercules, covering his forehead, thought Titus should thank Caroline during that moment, noticing his reaction angry even more. Caroline tweeted the cheeks and grunted that His Highness would have to wait a little while. Tea leaves she was infused with, she was annoyed but still called him master. Hercules noticed her dissatisfaction but just smiling and calling it. He stretched his hands with a gesture inviting her to come closer. Heavenly, holding the Caroline's tray, came to him. Hercules smiled warmly and, slanting himself on his knees, asked her to sit down. She wanted to give up, assuring that too heavy. But Hercules calmly replied that it was an order. Sighing Caroline carefully, he, kneeling Hercules with a smile, asked why she was so embarrassed because she did it without any hesitation. Her gaze, she murmured that it was not a workout. The guy laughed tightly and exclaimed that she was incredibly squeezed. Hercules still kept her in arms by apologizing. He acknowledged that seemed a little got carried away, and once again apologized. Caroline thought something clearly worried the hero. Hercules eventually agreed. All his life followed his father, and now for the first time he waged a war that was a huge burden. The common people watched carefully for his actions, not only military victories, but also political and financial solutions to the development of infrastructure. He needed to win this war to strengthen his power, and now he won the pressure. A little bit of the same, he was able to save Caroline, and it was equally important to him. The girl seriously said that in this case he simply obliged to appear on a banquet. He should show himself in front of Christopher and other bureaucrats. He had to prove his strength and courage as he did it on the battlefield when he had no doubt to save her. Hercules, in surprise, looked at her. Caroline suddenly realized that she had told unnecessary, and blushed. She quickly apologized to correctively. "I had to call you your greatness." But Hercules laughed her for his cheeks and pulled it lightly in the side of Caroline in surprise, and asked that he was still smiling. Hercules that she was right. If he appeared on the banquet of Christopher, could not be so easy to press on him. But instead of going there, he leaned closer to Caroline and asked her to be a little more. The girl, though embarrassed but with a smile, agreed in the meantime. Outside the window, high in the sky from the dense clouds, came out the moon of Hercules, called the Voice, and he sharply opened his eyes. Before him, a dark haze similar to a fog. It was a godless man. She sat on it in a light cape, barely hiding the shapes, and with a playful smile asked if he considers this night beautiful. She leaned closer and whispered that she came to fulfill the contract. But Hercules was not even surprised to see her devil laugh. Hercules did not immediately realize that she meant only, noticing that they were in a dream of the Asmodeus side. She realized that he was exhausted, but the contract had to be fulfilled. She wanted to get her as always, so hesitated, leaning closer and kissing him in his lips. Her name was Asmodeum, and Hercules was the only one who could see it. She was his restrained spirit of his secret force. Once she was cherubim, but became a fallen angel when she crossed the border of mortal sin of lust. Now she was a demon among the 72 pillars. She occupied the 32nd place of her title queen. Those who concluded with her contract received an unprecedented advantage, but instead she absorbed a lot of mana. But even more, 5 years ago, the patriarch praised Hercules for his achievement, saying that he was waiting for a great future. But Hercules then only silent. He thought that any of his family could do the same thing. It was enough to go to the library every day to learn the necessary knowledge. But the patriarch assured him that not all emperors were capable of. Hercules then only looked into the floor of his days, seemed the same. Suddenly a sharp pain pierced his head. He grabbed her for her. Groaned patriarch, frightened him. What happened in his head? He saw paintings who had never been in his life. That was not a place from other countries that could not be found in the library. All this looked alien to nothing of this world. Is he crazy? Patriarch asked anxiously whether she suggested that she suggested all the good with him, but Hercules strongly refused. He assured her that he would just rest and everything he would also ask to tell anyone, and the patriarch was forced to obey his order. Eventually she said that the class is over today, and if he is bad he can call a maid. Hercules raised his head and saw a mirror in front. He already felt like crazy, and at this moment it was knocked on the door by Hercules with annoyance that he was left alone. Finally, he opened the door. In front of him stood a woman in the clothes of a maid. She smiled at him. Hercules was surprised by a new maid. He was whistle, and asked if she was raised at least decently. because by force he opened his door with this persistent knock. But the maid only smiled mysteriously. And here she seemed to realize her mistake, instantly changed the outfit on her body. Only a light nightshirt and open linen. Hercules, frozen, shocked, sharply slamming the door, could not understand what was happening, how she could see the same outfit that was only in his memory. Behind the doors of the Asmodeum, maliciously giggling, Asmodia hung over Hercules without stopping laughing with his surprised expression. He could not understand how she did it, but the devil just smiled and said, "You seem to have the memory of that guy." Hercules did not understand what she was saying, as if reading his thoughts already knew that he was tormented by who he really was. She asked him not to worry, because these memories do not belong to him. "This man's memories you see from another world," explained they were. His memories had nothing to do with Hercules. At first, the guy thought that she referred to another kingdom, but Asmodia spoke of another world, another planet, with a completely different scale of time. Hercules narrowly narrowed his eyes. "Where do you know all this?" Asmodia smiled and replied, "Because I fed you with these memories." But soon he assured he no longer remembered this. Hercules grabbed for his throat, as if he suddenly began to strangle him. She explained that at the beginning of his existence, she gave him the memory of that man was curious about whom he would eventually win. Or the guy but seems to be a man without ambitions against his vain ambitious spirit. As a result of that boy disappeared, and his memories and emotions remained. "So you summed it up, and now the soul of that guy no longer threatens you." Heracles has thought of him something worry. "Why did you choose me?" he asked. Asmodia smiled. "Several centuries ago, there was a man who united the people of Lemuria and founded a monarchical state. He was my former master." She said it amazed his innovative approaches to the development of the state. She could not allow his inheritance to be destroyed. His death was futile. But his knowledge was enormous and the mind was outstanding. He could become a savior of Lemuria, so I used it. But now the most important thing to conclude the treaty. Hercules looked at her without understanding the Asmodia, still smiling, and apologized. "Of the 72 great spirits, I 32 hectares Queen Asmodeus." Hercules felt like a cold sweat mileage. She was the embodiment of one of the greatest human vices. He rushed to the door. "If I conclude a contract with you, then I end." But the door was not moving. They just did not open. In a panic, he began to beat his fists, trying to call for help, but his cries sank in foolish silence. Asmodia, without hurrying, came to him, put her palms on his head, and threw a sharp movement on the ground. "We are now in my world. It is just a dream. And no one will come to help in the real world. You just sleep." She leaned to him. Her face was very close. "And now," she whispered, "she will make a man from you." Hercules clenched his teeth with anger. "Who's the hell to take it?" The model, with bloodthirsty determination, again laughed at Hercules. She loved people who fought life, and was interesting how long he would withstand. Further, what he barely remembered, the night events, waking up at dawn. He found himself in his bed. On the pillow lay a devilish woman, who gently put her hand on his chest. After the contract, she became his perfect toy, though he asked her to stop feeling in his stomach. Night City streets were almost empty. Only one man sat on earth, as if waiting for someone. Suddenly in front of him appeared a man in a hood who first demanded money and then stretched out a bag with ringing coins. Elf gave him his item, declaring that now was his business. The man in the hood, examining the little thing in his hand, thought came that all this was done for the sake of the empire. Meanwhile, in the Caroline Palace, gathered at a fun feast, enjoying the festive atmosphere. Behind the pillars of the castle, hidden in the shadow, stood the older brother of Hercules, gloomy and silent. He watched the celebration approach the door and entered the emperor's room. Before him lay a pillow with the imperial crown that seemed like a delusion, because he could not believe that his brother really became Emperor. Adrien, scattering his teeth from anger. He was convinced that he needed the empire, so his thoughts were overwhelmed by the question of what the subordinate 3 elves were told by him, supporting him that His Highness Adrien was right. Nervously grabbing him for his clothes, Adrien said that his father had reached out to the crown, but only he touched the crown as patriarchs appeared, and strictly ordered to touch her forbidden. They looked dissatisfied with Adrien, and his brother recognized Archbishop that caused the pain of dissatisfaction. This crown was a great treasure of the Lemurian Empire, which was passed down from generation to generation. Only the Archbishop and the Emperor had the right to touch her. Adrien reluctantly recognized that he had chosen his father, and could not believe how the Archbishop dared to point to him on the son of the Emperor. He was convinced that the Emperor planned to make him heir. Though he could not understand this Adrien full of doubt, Patriarch became extremely serious, and with a frightening expression, once again asked not to touch the crown, warning that any hint could lead to his church, without praying for the peace of his soul. Adrien, angry to the edge, went to quit, that this day will be remembered forever. Patriarchs looked silently after him, simply fled those who do not get resting with suicide. The next day on the table appeared a gorgeous lunch. The sheet with a smile looked at the appetizing dishes, and Caroline standing nearby, too restrained saliva. His Majesty was informed that he was prepared all the best aquasamar harita capri with calzone and tomato paste, all that is full of his favorite tomatoes. Alain noted that food looks incredibly delicious. Hercules took a piece of pizza bite and thought out the chef came up closer. Hercules nodded and said that this time it turned out even better than the past. Chef almost jumped from the joy of his word were like music for the ears of a cook, and he promised to make even more effort to create a dish that would make His Majesty cry from happiness. By reducing the cost of infrastructure and maintenance of the palace, he directed funds for the best products and improvement of culinary arts. Only the best chefs were allowed to cook, and the products were selected from all over the empire. That is why all the food before him was perfect. But something in it seemed strange. He suddenly said that all this stale chef was frozen. At first thought that the food was not liked, but it was wrong. Pizza tomatoes are flawless, and taste does not change this. Already tired chef, in surprise lifting the eyebrows of Caroline, carefully asked if he would like to try something else. Hercules mentioned ancient memories and decided that he wanted to taste the dish. He called her curry cook. Not understanding, nodded and went to the kitchen. But Hercules stopped him, explaining that he was a completely different dish. Curry, haired dish, in which use a lot of spices and seasoning. It is prepared cutting, frying, sometimes adding fruits to the main spices of coriander, cardamom, curcuma, chile black, and cayenne pepper. Caroline was amazed that did not even imagine such a dish of cook. His face spoke about otherwise to get everything out of memory will be difficult. Therefore the kulak made the decision to look for the necessary spices even outside the empire. Hercules introduced a new cook named Nala. Girl confidently went forward and greeted. Cook was stunned and asked sharply the emperor what this slave was doing. Hercules calmly replied that he wanted to taste curry, and all the necessary spices can be found in their country. That is why he brought their cook. So once he was a slave, but the Church of the Messiah converted him to his faith. And now he freely came to his chef, shook his hand, and called him his boss. Sincerely rejoicing in the chef, noted that she spoke with special respect for his chef. Lemurian Palace. He still had his pride. He couldn't just let in the unknown to his shrine. Therefore, he suggested that he first check the culinary abilities of a newcomer, and then made the decision. Hercules agreed. And the idea of he gathered his subordinates and seated judges at 2 tables. When everything was ready, he stated that he had collected the best jury for the sake of the good of the palace. He announced that it was time for tasting, and he would also participate in the jury for 7 people, and everyone had to appreciate the dish to his taste. For formality, he even temporarily appointed Nalo courtyard. Caroline smiled. I was curious about what a taste had a curry. But Hercules said that he wanted to know it first. Caroline's father once tasted the food of the Sondilian, and waited for this moment. However, for a simple bishop, such exotic food with a lot of spices was unacceptable. Why is he here? Finally the finale. Before the jury was taken out the dishes and the chef apologized for expectations. Hercules carefully watched as before him solemnly opened a dish. His eyes lit up, all looked just gorgeous. Before them were brown with chicken and oil spinach, kari kimakari and tandoori with chicken. The smell was incredible. Christopher felt a wave of nostalgia. Caroline entrusted that it looks just a stunning panther. Just after a crushing, that the dish looked like a very sharp. Chef was still stunned on the plate in front of him. The bishop smiled and offered to pray first. They turned to the father's archithanking by asking for a blessing of food. All those present were bowed to be pleading that this dish became support for their body, and the spirit of prayer ended. Hercules smiled and said it's time to start. Taking the cake, he thought out where to start with the end. He dipped a piece in one of the brown, and the first tasted his. Caroline and Panther intensely watched his reaction. The channel did not resist, and asked His Majesty as a taste of Hercules for a moment, and then his eyes flashed. It is incredibly delicious. He insisted that everyone immediately tried some to take spinat brown, with other tandoori. Someone chose kimakari. In half an hour on the table did not leave a single piece. Caroline enjoyed every piece of telling about the incredible taste symphony of Sandilia cuisine. while the patriarch argued that such luxurious food is not allowed to eat, and General Panther patiently waited for the dish. A smiling chef felt that each of the guests sincerely appreciated his culinary talent. He was surprised to look at the dishes that kept the mysterious taste of a stranger who, although sharp, prompted new discoveries. Trying the dish, the cook was impressed with the taste created by Heracles exceeded all expectations, and the hero was confident in his assumptions that food would become even more acute, keeping his unmatched. The chef apologized to explain what he prepared according to his own recipe, that caused the surprise of Hercules, and filled the atmosphere with unusual culinary magic. The emperor realized that in their hot country, spicy food makes people sweat because hot curry is instantly cooled by giving refreshing pleasure even on the hottest days. Not sure of the local attitude to the sharp tastes, he added apple juice and honey to satisfy the Caroline that preferred sweeter tastes. And the channel enjoyed seeing the satisfied faces of guests that jointly appreciated his culinary experiments, recalling children's images when it was called a waste and said that he would all his life clean the potatoes. Chef quiet. Markelli smiled and announced that it was time to make a sentence. Everyone who wants to taste the masterpieces of Nali should raise his hand to demonstrate his passion and gratitude. All subordinates eagerly lifted Caroline's hands, sought the sweetness of Panther, and Hercules expressed his desire to try curry with new ingredients that would give the dish a special charm. Hercules addressed the cook with interest in his opinion about further experiments, and in his gaze flashed a spark of inspiration for new culinary discoveries. After a brief reflection, the chef raised his hand and stated that the food became truly suitable for the Lemurians should get rid of excessive bitterness that overshadowed the taste palate. He also stressed that Nala should notify it when the dishes of non-standard size were needed. Nala apologized to explaining the need for such remarks, and the chefuhar had to bear the appropriate reprimanded Hercules with a smile as Caroline asked for a tando. Rising from the table, the cook announced that he was preparing desserts, and looking at Nalo with nostalgia, remembered his past when the struggle for a place under the sun became a real test. Too fascinated by his own position, he barely mentioned the main thing until the words Nell reminded the power of human smiles. After such a spicy dinner, he decided to prepare refreshing fruit desserts that give new breath. Turning, the chef saw as an emperor with a full belly and a sincere smile shared his impressions that he had not felt such a satiety for a long time, and this moment became a real culmination of the evening. The chef apologized and announced that the desserts are ready, and Hercules' eyes shone again, like the rays of the sun promised a sweet end of the evening. He gave the emperor a fresh melon, and Hercules tasted it, confessed that after a sharp brown, this refreshing taste a real salvation that caused the gentle laughter of Caroline. Although the dessert could be given to other members of the Panther jury, dissatisfied, and incomprehensibly glanced at the plate while Hercules completed the last piece with an expression of pleasure. Suddenly, Hercules noticed a strange liquid shouted out loud, and ordered no one to touch the dish. All the alarm, and the chef was surprised to lift his gaze on the emperor. Caroline wanted to run up to Hercules, but the panther sharply turned her, and a strong blow to the fist struck in the upper body. All with horror watched as Carolina flew to the floor, and his father, without holding back anger, grabbed a panther for his clothes, asking that she planned, although Hercules ordered to stop this mess. Soon it turned out that the melon was poisoned. Meyer's staff were shocked about His Majesty poisoning Whisper, because the topic was a taboo and mysterious poison in melon aroused great interest and fear. By a decisive step tapping the heels on the floor, the girl moved forward, and the elf trying to catch up with the princess where she hurried, because she needed to talk to Hercules, although obsolete orders forbade that. Dushi, to have 3 princes, categorically stated that His Majesty is their country's future, and that her son's most important thing, and she was worried about his safety with all maternal love. She could not understand how it could happen, and having prayed a prayer seized God for help for her son, hoping for a miracle that would save him. Patriarch carefully measured the pulse and the temperature of Hercules, soothing all the messages that the state of the emperor stable. He fortunately did not bite that part of the dessert where was the poison. Christopher could not believe that it was possible to poison melon. Probably criminals made small openings and introduced an exact dose. Due to the diligence of Dios, who noticed rust on his plate, the danger was turned, although those sitting nearby were surprised. And Caroline sighed hard in silence, taking the situation in silence. General, ashamed by his behavior after his former enemy hit his daughter before His Majesty and his father, thanked Davos for salvation, while Heracles was surprised to look at the chef, could not understand how such poison could happen. The boss confidently stated that he was preparing from his soul and never thought of killing his own creation, especially the emperor, and Hercules asked with interest, "Where did this melon come from?" He replied that the melon was brought by Adrien's assistant Pan Delnicole that confirmed his words. On the corridor, the chef met Delnicola, who was heading to the kitchen that the melon was brought to celebrate the victory of the emperor. Delnicolas may have been an aristocrat close to Adrien, dissatisfied with his own position, because of which he joined the opposition. Patriarch thought of doubting the sincerity of his words. Hearing the story of Hercules understood everything, and the general was shocked as Adrien could seek the crown by committing a crime, while Christopher realized the absence of a feast. Patriarch suggested looking for Dominic, but Hercules considered it a futile business because of his employment with imports and exports of fruit. The chief begged to believe the cook without suspecting that the melon was poisoned, and the channel defending him emphasized his honesty. However, Hercules' doubt the truth forbade the cook to return to the kitchen, and when the guards took him to Caroline, who also tasted the poisonous melon, asked, "Why are you here?" Carolina replied that he could not just go to bed while his life is in danger, and felt the need to be near defending him, but did not have time to finish as an unknown hand grabbed it and pulled it. When the emperor took a seat on the bed, he gently put Carolina to himself, and she was always excitedly discounted. Suddenly, when she didn't know that answering the door opened, and the room entered the woman who apologized. It was Carolina's mother and the wife of General Galfez, who was concerned about the emperor's condition despite the request of the Galfez. Caroline worriedly jumped on a bed, and the guards quietly noticed that the situation is not critical. She leaned to the emperor and apologized for the helplessness of her husband and daughter at a critical moment, after which Hercules smiled and suggested that Galeon thank her daughter. The girl came to the dissatisfied panther, bowed, and sincerely thanked, admiring his muscles that left his embarrassed. The young girl suggested that the hero to taste the bean-free soup because the garlic can neutralize the poison, and the patriarch noted that this is a great idea, recommended by the hero to use more garlic. Hercules, contacting Carolina, asked if she could join, but she shyly confessed that garlic did not like the emperor. But the emperor took a spoon and ordered her to open her mouth for tasting. She remembered as she could not even kiss him in such circumstances, and her mother of Carolina put her hand to her lips, whispered to the emperor that her daughter was still virgin, and Carolina heard it ashamed, and quickly swallowed her soup, declaring her mother loudly that she found the perfect moment for conversation. But she was worried about her future because the years dedicated to the martial arts distracted her from her personal dreams. Carolina asked if she understood to whom this message was addressed, and Galf stressed that such information is extremely important, without believing that her father is also present there too. Finally, the girl hugged her daughter gently, saying that she was such a charming. But Carolina tried to give up hugs, reminding that the emperor was standing in front of them. After an incident with his brother 10 years ago, Hercules' father reviewed their educational course and restricted meetings with his mother. Boyan ordered not to turn to the child as their father. Their meetings became purely a formality that lasted even after the death of his father. She visited the emperor, but when he did not come, that he had left Hercules with a bitter feeling of loss. Earlier he remembered how he heard the voice of his mother, who gently addressed his majesty by name, filling his thoughts with a mixture of nostalgia and anxiety. The servant behind her apologized to, explaining that he tried to stop her. But she did not listen to Hercules. She was strikingly watch. Hercules realized that his illness is not a simple fever, but an attempt to kill him, and realized that his mother would no doubt rush to his son when the threat would become reality. She came up to him saying that she came to talk about the events of the day, and asked if the culprit of the crime managed. Hercules was convinced that his brother was involved. Although the evidence was not enough for the mother, they were both equal, and his brother never gave up nearby, and Hercules believed that she was once a father. The woman appealed to the emperor with a request for saving that surprised Hercules with her unexpected tenderness. She told how every day he tried to become better, and always looked at him with love to tell him how important it was for her words that moved the heart of a hero. The mother was sure that the brother acted impulsively, not wanting to harm, and reminded that he was her native request for mercy through the entire atmosphere. Hercules asked whether it was all for the sake of what she came, and she asked a question that emphasized his uncertainty of evidence, and was not enough, and nothing was impossible to do anything. As the emperor, he could not close his eyes and stated that the culprit should be given to court without leaving any doubt. The woman was shocked. She grabbed Hercules by her pants and begged that he was not killed, while Christopher, trying to push his sister, created even more chaos. He addressed the emperor by name as a son. A Hercules with compassion and determination promised to do everything possible within his forces. With her hands crossed, she went to the exit, declaring that he intends to go to the monastery seeking rest among the stormy events. She sought to pray for her husband's peace of fulfillment of the dream of a son, and atonement of her own sin for inaction of her decisive giving to God, surprised all present and left a mark in the hearts of witnesses. He was a man who always remained a man who walked the way of a man who was a man. When the mother closed the door of Carolina in the questioning of Hercules, without spending time, he ordered the Galfay and Christopher to gather all the time to make a decision. His brother will stand before court. Meanwhile, Adrien was engulfed in a fury of a pillow with scissors, annoyedly murmuring about which he hated. He despised the very opinion that he survived suddenly to the room when a servant, telling him that his mother wanted to see him. In response, he had flew hearing Adrien. Squeezing his teeth, he cursed the elders gathering. Meanwhile, Mercury stood before the tribunes, referring to the respected parents and future rulers. He made a speech that their country was in danger. He stated that the enemies of the Ticks have already selected the lands in them, and if they do not work, they will lose all they have to bring back their thing. For what once his grandfather at his disposal is already a powerful army, and their chances are huge. He lifted his fist up to proclaim war for returning their land. His speech was met by exclamations of approval. Adrien stared in a portrait of his late father, and asked why he never gave him a crown. Deep night, when Adrien was lying in bed, suddenly heard the creaking door. He wary turned his head. Just in front of him stood a girl who looked closely at him. She smiled. The stranger was greeted and wished him good evening. She said that this night extremely beautiful. Adrien looked at her with surprise and embarrassment. Surprised, he asked who she was, a girl standing in front of him. And behind her back, the wings of light were glowing with a playful smiling and saying that she thought people like such greetings. In a moment her body wrapped lightweight, and she explained that he was the archangel of the first of the 3 pillars. Adrien from the fright slipped and fell out of bed. He could not believe that before him a real archangel girl, a girlfriend, seeing his reaction, and he turned murmur that never imagined that angels could dress so much. She gently lifted his face with her hands and said that she came with a message from God. She told him that Hercules, the current ruler of this country, would soon go on a campaign to the Trabzon Principality. Due to his brilliant achievement and surrender of Davos, he gained widespread support in the country and rushes to return the lost lands. Although Adrien was indignant due to the collapse. According to her, the information was heard directly, and the plans will begin with the principality trains, because the collection of nobles was directed to discuss this ambitious strategy. Hercules stated that the blow would begin with Dalios, because it was important for him to understand the causes of the enemy's defeat, and therefore, he was interested in Panther's thought symbol. Polly believed that the defeat happened due to the lack of a worthy leader for the big army, because if another force commander could be distributed much more efficiently. However, he did not have the opportunity to choose another commander because even mercenaries could easily bribe. And the emperor demonstrated that the lost battle was the result of the abduction of parental lands. Hercules was aware of the motives of Dalios and felt solidarity with him. But the expansion of possessions did not make sense without the ability to wisely manage the country and to do things correctly. After expressing their thoughts, Hercules wanted to hear the Lemurians because their guidance on battle was so convincing that they did not cause any complaints about the strategy. The main question concerned weapons, and when Hercules skillfully demonstrated weapons on Caroline's table with suspicion that this decision was really optimal. In the Battle of Personia, infantrymen owned swords and shields, and some of the troops used long Saurus spears, which Lemurians used for millennia ago, providing a cavalry thanks to a length of 5 meters. Their kingdom is surrounded by deserts of plains and mountainous terrain, forced to fight nomads and mountain inhabitants. That prompts you to reflect on the replacement of daggers with spears for better adaptation to the landscape. That the hostile army did not get them to use weapons up to 7 meters long, and the shield served as a reliable protection against arrow. Further, Oos suggested an incredible idea to apply everything at once, and although Galfy expressed it easily to implement such a strategy, seemed impossible because the emperor sought to know what other options could be implemented. Pointing to Panther, Hercules received an unexpected inspiration to create an army that will train on the way to battle. A archangel reported Adrien that every step was a new training that caused a smile from his brother. Some stated that their campaign failed, that created doubt about the correctness of the chosen strategy, and forced to rethink previous decisions. This meant that to achieve the Principality of Trevizos, they had to go by the sea. But the anger of the spirits promised a storm that would destroy the fleet by carrying ships by waves and condemning them to death. Adrien was surprised to watch the events very smoothly. Although the Archangel explained that in the other world, the huge army twice got into a storm that gave rise to legends about the mighty wind, while Hercules did not realize the importance of gathering troops for the campaign at all. Despite the Homer and ambitious plans by Adrien coldly stated that his indifference to these events seemed to be happening around him. He carefully guarded the throne of his father, who tirelessly defended the country and traditions, because everything was valuable to him, inherited from generation to generation. Adrien loved his father above all else, and the loss of him caused such an unbearable longing that every moment without him broke his heart into small fragments. Only after his departure over the king's bed, a mystical clear light appeared as if a sign of something unusual shone in the face of his most. When Adrien reached out to this mysterious glow, it suddenly collapsed before everyone goes down ruthlessly directly on Hercules. Although his soul burns even the vassal's father, and the magic of the inheritance chose Hercules, and everyone worshipped the new emperor, because the motherland was the most valuable for Adrien, though his abilities remained in the shadow. Seeing the magic seal, he ordered to obey the new emperor, because this sign was an indisputable proof of inevitable changes. An angry and painful pain, he believed that the inheritance of the motherland and the love of ancestors should belong to him, and dreamed of destroying the one who stole everything. Archangel smiling slightly, assured that now the gentleman would protect him, and soon he will take the rightful place to revive the empire. Although Adrien did not understand the meaning of her words, the girl pressed the guy to her graceful forms, assured him that everything would come true, but first promised a generous reward for making him loudly ask if he really was able to become an emperor, until he jumped out of bed, stretching out of bed. Realizing that only a void in his hand, he suggested that it was just a dream. But remembering that the Archangel did not unexpectedly heard a quiet, sinister rustle. Looking at the hand that held a piece of paper, he decided to unfold him, not knowing what would be inside, and was stunned by what he saw. On the sheet, a map of the route to the Principality of Treviso gleamed a mysterious and strange, supplemented with a light pen that flew nearby, and taking it in the hands of Adrien realized everything. Suddenly laughing with the bloodthirsty smile, Adrien was sure that now he would be able to overthrow Hercules from the throne and regain all the lost power. When the servant entered the room for the violation of the violation that he saw, the Highness already woke up, and Adrien appealed to Dominic, ordered to gather troops, because Hercules prepared a campaign on the Principality of Trebiosus to strike immediately after returning. Dominic was alarmed because he could not understand why Adrien now plans the uprising. But he approached the curtain, firmly stated that now the Lord God himself stands on his side. With these words, he sharply pushed the curtains on the window, opening a new look at the future. Wrapped in a curtain of languages in a cloak, he coldly declared that all the dirt and grief of his life, as a result of a treacherous brother, he would ruthlessly punish. Hercules, ordered to act on the approved plan of the maid, began to prepare, and he promised the people that the lost land would soon return. Because Christopher was convinced that everything would come true, Caroline tightly squeezed Hercules' hand decisively, assuring that he would not allow any betrayal, though his smile gave out doubtful confidence. Smiling, Hercules made sure that his brother had not noticed the whole map of events, and with such thoughts, moved to leaving the castle. Having gone under his balcony, he spread his hands for the public that was waiting for his majestic appearance, filled with confidence and peace. Meanwhile, Adrien looked at the window, remembering how a few days ago Hercules began to realize his plan that caused anxiety. The people who chatted among themselves listened to the conversations, silently remembering the words of the Archangel Jibral about the unusual vision that came to the Highness in a dream, and Adrien suddenly stopped. He looked back at the gathered nobles with fear in the eyes, of ordering listening, because his choice should be decisive, because he is a favorite of the gods and the real emperor. This message was to be compensated for all his suffering by the chance of a gifted Archangel Jibral, and Adrien could not miss such an opportunity, because aristocrats were silently agreed with him. Growing gloomily on the Bulgarian, he assumed that their trade relations with the emperor also have their shortcomings as his own ambitions. Bulgarians of the nomadic people with impurities of the nobility, Adrien, reading the thoughts of the aristocrats, immediately understood their barbaric nature, and the intention to use it on the battlefield became only a logical step to power. Suddenly, the door rolled up, and annoyedly asked about the noise. Adrien heard how an apologious elf reported that Hercules, along with the army with 40,000 Lemurians, sank in Marine Ardi. Initially, the voices of the discussion rushed to the vision of vision, and Dominic was interested in asking what Adrien thinks. He received a gentle smile and a confident statement that he finally understood the meaning of this sign message. Turning to the aristocrats collected, he stressed that their wisdom was discovered by the refusal to listen to the empty chats. Raising his hand to the sky, Adrien got a powerful response of the people who exclaimed and greeted him as a true emperor, confirming his determination and power. According to the maps of the sea routes, Hercules had to return to this port that became a key point of his strategy, opening up opportunities for the future battle. On the most famous plateau near the port of Adrien was full of fiercely dreamed of throwing an enemy out of a horse to make him get out of pain and ruthlessly deprive of life, marking the end of his possession. Standing in the armor before the army, Adrien raised his hands and loudly proclaimed that his brother feels all the harshness of his father's grave as a sign of justice and family honor. Sitting on a check next to his soldiers, Adrien thought why Hercules may be late for his troops to decrease to invisibility, and suddenly the watchman announced the approach of the enemy's detachment. At that moment he laughed at tears from impatience, because the day of meeting with his brother was the only chance, and boldly demanded that Hercules immediately showing his face. Soon on the horizon, Hercules appeared majestically, path ahead of his army, which marched on horseback. Seeing such an enormous army, Adrien embraced horror, and barely holding back the curse, said abusive words that reflected his unexpected disappointment. He could not believe his eyes. The endless army of Hercules unfolded in front of him, demonstrating boundless power that challenged all the laws of nature. Adrien appealed to one of the soldiers why the majority of the troops had to stay on the bottom of the sea. And now they looked so cheerfully that, contrary to the orders of the archangels, and raised doubt about the mercy of the marine spirit. Seeing Adriana from afar, Hercules noted that his nervousness only reinforces determination and warns of the inevitable battle of decisive importance. With a wry smile, Hercules asked whether Carolina sees this majestic performance, but she sadly lowered her head, not wanting to confess in her fears before the future. A man came behind and bitterly stated that it was just a pathetic spectacle, because Adrien did not check the information in the legend of a sunk army, which was manifested. Hercules smiled gently, saying that Adrien is their common brother, Edmund, a little ashamed for misunderstanding with booking. This testified that Edmund Alamand from a family of warriors and a brother on the line of his father, because during the war with Davos he guarded the capital. But this time duties entrusted Harfisi. Hercules noted that Edmund differs from all because most live in the same conditions. Edmund, sighing, perceived it as a compliment, and Caroline stressed that Titus was waiting for a task. However, Tit refused to participate. The younger brother came to him, emphasizing that this orders of His Majesty, but squeezing his Malbert Titi firmly stated that he was not concerned about throwing a brush. He would embarrass his family because he would die with a brush. Tired of the betrayal, Hercules laid his ears on a story, and Caroline suggested not to come to a meeting because human behavior was exhausted by his patience to the limit. He approached Titus and asked about the situation with Skits near the castle. His eyes lit up, and he gladly agreed to support the plan with passion. Hercules stated that it could be bribed easily, and Edmund knows not to answer that he was felt that he was surrounded only by brotherly voices. But Hercules, smiling firmly, stated that it would serve better than to die in the castle. With sadness in the eyes of Hercules, watched Adrien, who did not suspect, remain immersed in his thoughts, without noticing the surrounding changes. A father bowing his head before the nobility sought to enter the ranks of the emperors, while the mother, violating the bans, sincerely bowing to the nobles, trying to smooth the blame in front of his son. Everyone loved Adrien above all, because he always occupied a special place in their hearts, gaining boundless love and respect. Achilles did not steal anything from his brother, that if the latter did not make mistakes, it would become an emperor. But he would be sorry that he would now have to lead the country that his parents loved so much. Hercules firmly stated that the purification begins to eradicate the spoiling force, and to prepare the way to revive justice. General Pandarus reported that that is where they will find out about anyone who joined the uprising, by revealing every plot and betrayal. The meeting was to become decisive. They planned to suppress Adrien and his accomplices, to snatch the infection with the root, because one grand fight looked better than endless gradual cleaning. Galf, with a high voice, reported His Majesty that arrived. That became the last signal to the beginning of the decisive confrontation. Hercules, with genuine joy, met Galfy, learning that Christopher was in order, although he regretted because of the inability to meet quarreling nephews, because the careful Christopher had already returned under careful protection in the castle. Hercules persistently stated that it should be finished immediately, and returning home with invaluable souvenirs and exciting stories, that would inevitably inspire people. Looking at his brother Adrien with distrust, Jabral asked why, despite his promise, his army did not sink in the sea because, according to the prophet, the Lord stood on his side. I am convinced that this divine trial should be easily overcome by Adrien immediately learned the power of his army, hoping for a brilliant victory. His troops numbered 18,000 infantrymen, 2,000 crossbows with cavalry, and an additional 8,000 cavalry who together created a powerful shock contingent. In total, the number of his soldiers was about 30,000, while the hostile detachment defended on the walls of the fort was about 40,000, among which 20,000 infantrymen and 10,000 archers with cavalrymen. Despite the exceeding the enemy by 10,000 fighters, Adrien was absolute in his confidence that the glory of their troops would begin on this plateau, though suddenly someone called him to wait for him. He was approached by a young dark-skinned warrior with curls who advised to avoid the battles on the plateau. On that annoyed Adrien asked who was this stranger. Introducing as an Oscar Alman soldier, asked His Majesty again to review the decision, and another voice of whisper added that the Oscar younger son from the respected family Alman. The Almanjas family, owners of major Mesri and southern lands, have always been a reliable financial support of the empire, although the ancient envy of long-legged and disputes with elves often have become a reason for sharp debate. At this point, the Almanjas family joined the wing of Adrien, but unfortunately for Oscar of the second son, who was appointed Adriano's advisor, he noted his namelessness, although Oscar himself was aware of His Majesty. At the moment, the forces of both sides were almost balanced. However, the enemy was headed by General Harnesses with an elite army, and Oscar considered the most dangerous opponent a heavy cavalry that provided a strategic advantage. As for its own army, its diversity and problems in interaction through wearing outdated armor seemed an integral part, although Adrien did not consider it a problem, and Askir silently hinted that everything was not so easy. Soon he confessed that by Mrs. Jabral's prophecy, the army Hercules had to sink. But the enemy was carefully prepared for battle that dramatically changed the picture of the battle. Because of this, Oscar felt that his troops were trapped, because the chances of victory were higher if the battle was happening near the fortress and not on the plateau. He asked Adrien to share additional thoughts while the latter seemed almost obsessive. Grabbing a guy for a chainmail, Adrien lifted him and asked sharply, "What do you know about our idea to score the fortress?" After all, his words ignited the emperor's anger. Untreated by numerous humiliations from his brother Adrien, promised that even the purest plateau would be a field for him to win, and ordered Oscar not to make a challenge to imperial power. In the outbreak of anger, he rejected the guy so that he was powerless, fell to the ground, and strictly ordered to return to his place if he wanted to keep his honor. Picking his teeth, Oscar tilted his head, and then quietly asking the advice in a hurry, while Adrien raised his hand and declared, "We are blessed by God himself," by ordering to keep morale. Oscar firmly believed that Adrien would not withstand because Hercules would undoubtedly win the victory, so he had to come up with a cunning plan to save the army. It was 3 days from meeting the armies of Hercules and Adrien. Both sides completed fortifications, and provocative actions are missing silence before the inevitable storm. Looking at the distance where the flickered outpost of the army of Hercules, Adrien felt someone suddenly approaching behind, awakening the premonition of danger. Valios looked through the spiritual eye. That hostile army had about 30,000 fighters skillfully prepared, although Hercules believed that aristocrats were not able to gather such powerful power. In their army, not only the emperor holds the key position of aristocracy, also has his own soldiers, whose experience has repeatedly checked the time. Comparing this empire with another one can say that it is extremely dangerous even after repelling the attacks. By combining your hand, you can create an army invincible, so Hercules did not like aristocrats. Their blood boils as a gift of gods gave them power that could not be ignored. Dario stated that the same applies to His Majesty, and Hercules agreed. However, he noted that spoiled blood ties turn into red water that rot, so they need to be returned to divine power immediately. Looking at Hercules' assistants asked that they would tell his proposal sitting with Darius on a survey tower when someone came up to them. Bulgarian and Carolina appeared on the horizon. Galfi was surprised to ask if the enemy's side received from Hercules the assurance that everything was all right. He called them. The Bulgarian troops of the Motavor mothers in the open battle had almost no advantage that seemed strange to Hercules, so he immediately sent a messenger to them to clarify the situation. Hercules addressed the Bulgarian commander with a deep look in surprise to ask where he knows their language, explaining that finding a personal teacher is not so difficult to find a personal teacher. Barely smiling, he noted that a real ally as an emperor should know the language of his friends, that only confirms the strength of their connection. Exchanging a solid handshake, Bulgarian general noted the youth of the emperor, and Hercules proposed to go to his tent, leaving the rest under the guidance of Harphis. Hercules quietly admitted that this time he was ready to close his eyes on the unpleasant and approaching the table with paper and pen, suggested to make a clear arrangement. General sighing hard and settling on a creaking chair before the emperor reported that the agreement was divided into 4 main parts. The agreement included the ban on the opening of trade routes by the duty of the Bulgarian king, to set troops at the request of Emperor Lemuria, and the annual tax that the warriors asked Hercules inquisitively. The sheets stress that being a nomadic people they cannot count on a better life if they give up agriculture because farming requires grain and trade in farming. They decided to use the struggle for the throne as a means to provide the necessary throne if the throne is not available. Hercules smiled evenly and asked whether the general was ready to compromise in case of failure. That caused an alarming look directed directly at the emperor. According to him, if Hercules declared their allies, it could be a misdemeanor. General took a pen, decided that Bulgarian would no longer participate in the war, stunningly contemplating with a piercing look that seemed to know all mysteries. I am convinced that any mistake could cost them an emperor's life, took paper, and announced that now all related agreements by ordering friends to retreat immediately. Adrien watched with horror as the Bulgarian army retreated, and screaming loudly that they would not break the system, when the soldier reported that the Bulgarian envoy concluded an agreement with the Lemurian Empire. Under the terms of the agreement, the Bulgarian troops had to withdraw from the war that made Adriana reach madness from unexpected betrayal. The fury of Adrien struck with force, struck a soldier on his face calling him a damn nomad, and pouring a fighter to the ground, loudly asked why everyone wanted to betray him. Brooding the boy's face, Adrien did not stop screaming until he broke the resistance and calmed down, then climbed over the crushed warrior, barely smiled. Adopting the situation, Adrien announced that events would become even more interesting with God on his side. This trial will only strengthen his determination to become the sole ruler. Although the advantage was only 10,000 fighters, Adrien was sure that the victory over Hercules is a trifle, because Mrs. Gibral's words were reminiscent of Lemuria's future in his hands. When a wounded soldier was slowly coming to Adrien, strongly ordered enough time to spend time to take up weapons and act without delay. Achilles noted that the Bulgarians have fulfilled their part of the agreement by the national Bulgarian army, with its effective command different from the aristocrats' chaotic forces, and eliminated the main obstacle. Pulling the sword from the sword, Hercules lifted him up and announced that it was time to meet in battle with his brother, without delaying for a moment. By ordering, he gathered all the participants of the battle, forcing everyone to take their place in the arena of the future confrontation. Voicefully stating that God stands on his side, Adrien ordered the army to destroy the merchants and eliminate the false emperor of the traitor of the people. Marshs and crossbow takers, compacted in rows, prepared for battle on both sides, and suddenly a continuous hail of arrows flew throughout the arena. By causing the spirits of the wind, they sent their invisible force to the enemy, opening a new front of an elusive attack. By order of dozens of insects, swarms have hastily headed by arrows to attack as part of a thoroughly planned strategy. The Kulaki ordered the heavy cavalry to come, and the soldiers, causing powerful blows into a huge tambour. Adrien was loudly urged not to delay, ordering soldiers to spread the cavalry to the last drop of force without leaving the place of doubt. The cavalrymen entered a fierce battle, appealing to the spirits of the wind to reveal all the power of the empire, and Galfi caused the majestic spirit. Accompanied by the spirit, the majestic Aemon rapidly caught up enemies by immersing them in panic horror that scattered any hope for victory. Spirit, like a powerful blow to the element, rapidly struck its expansive force on enemies by cutting their army, leaving all defenseless, and struck. Galfi, watching people turning into ashes with bitterness, called them as a slack, claiming that they are not able to withstand the roaring steps of his ruthless power. The hostile cavalry was loudly outraged by blaming him of betray. Frightened and filled with strict condemnation, Hercules shouted that it was impossible to humiliate a person who lived a little longer than young soldiers, and stated that he would start criticism from the boys. Turning to a mighty spirit, he asked to show Andromealy a place where the ignorance is collected, so that everyone could see the consequences of their incompetence. It is unknown, but cavaliers began to sink in a mysterious black mucus, and the warriors feared that their hands were left without weapons under the influence of amazing ability to steal things from random people. According to legend, this spiritual spirit had the ability in a certain radius to abduct property capable of picking up things from 300 soldiers, and soldiers demanded the return of lost weapons and some even without helmet. Without kicking, Caroline went by gallop forward, loudly screaming to hear the enemy as she looks angry at everyone who dares to withstand her. Turning to Edmund, Caroline announced that her next course came because she concluded a contract with Lego's strongest spirit, demonstrating that she was a real knight, and Edmund was glad to fight next to her. However, in the middle of the battle, something suddenly fell directly on the face of the old pants, that he decided to return after the battle. Because Andromelia, though stealing mostly weapons and armor, sometimes left such strange things, General Panther reported His Majesty that his army demonstrates incredible force, because Hercules spent a lot of time on their careful preparation for the decisive confrontation. At first he planned to send Halbert Diers on the forefront, but because of the unexpected reaction of the enemy was forced to give up this idea that the general called the wise decision, and Hercules pointing down confirmed the absence of Titus. The crossbow was ordered to fire on the enemy, when a huge drawn tiger appeared in the arena by creating chaos among soldiers. The crossbow takers were frightened by the appearance of the monster, could not understand his origin. And Ant, based on the shields of warriors with a brush in his hand, admired his new creation, while the cowardly arrived soldier looked at him in a confused soldier. Soldiers fearing flying arrows asked for His Highness to lean and lower his head. But Ant, without worrying behind the warriors and declaring Brucia de Kiribia, immediately began to create his next masterpiece. Tita's spirit. Decorated Decorabia style radiated the juice that enlivened the paintings, by giving them incredible strength and brightness. The next masterpiece of Titus became a bird by summoned to the reality of a two-headed eagle. He ordered him to cut off by the claws of traitors ruthlessly impress the enemy. After waving a tactician, Titi ordered his creation to fly forward, and when the bird reached the enemy, his claws paws began to lift the warriors into the air as if causing chaos. Brick, with the delight of revitalizing his creations, Titi enjoyed every moment while the soldiers asked him to hide. Then he saw his eagle pierced with arrow that added drama of battle. The enemy's crossbowman saw that it was only empty paper, did not expect a ridicule, but Titus was angry with such disdain. Heavenly asking Hercules about the condition of his brother, the commander noted that the spirit of Tita, though useful, is not celebrated. Hercules also believed that his strength would only be enough for a few paintings, while Adrien was angry with his fist with a concrete fortress, cursed by a false emperor, and asking how they dare. Adrien ordered to kill Titus, believing that he could no longer use the spirit, and could not understand why he is still alive, in spite of his betrayal. Bombardment in such a chaotic situation could not linger for a long time, so Adrien ordered everyone to move forward, and soon again heard the powerful sound of the tambourine calling to action, loudly proclaiming that the infantrymen had already moved to the attack by Hercules. Persistently demanded that every warrior would immediately join the fighting without delaying for a moment. By ordering Titus to take the fortress of Hercules, instructed crossbowmen to slide and retreat to prepare the army for the next tactical steps. Instead, the Hallards instantly came to the attack by replacing retreating forces and opening a new front to press the enemy. Achilles turned to Darius that as well as planned command by the right flank remains him. And General Panther smiled confidently, declaring what he knows what to do. Hercules was looking forward to seeing the stupid face of his brother, hoping for a little victory in this fierce confrontation. Tarcules, full of cunning smile, walked on the wall of the fortress, while Adrien, gnashing his teeth from rage, closely watched his brother and thought about his treacherous plans. The police ordered the archers to retreat one of the two sides, while Alberts had to cover the departure without letting the enemies break through, and the shooters hurried to restlessly holding their line. Darius loudly urged police to cover flanks and provide a stable system, because every step had a certain rhythm and value. Listlets met the swordsmen who strongly advanced could not break their ranks, so Heracles ordered Darius to protect the forces of the army and restrain his warriors from a hasty assault. Screaming loudly at the military and calling them idiots, he could not understand their actions and ordered the easy cavalry to replace infantry. However, the spirit of Galfi language's hard referee did not allow this mistake to strike a light cavalry. Before the enemy cavalry, a terrible wave launched a helplessness to the horses. Adrien, fiercely gnashing teeth and cursed by Galfa, despite his respect, cannot understand why choosing fell on his stupid brother. Adrien's army was exhausted, and Oscar was concerned about the fortress, without understanding why that idiot gave bad orders one by one. Oscar closely followed the movement of Hercules' army by analyzing every detail to make the right tactical decision. The hostile army moving into the flank seemed to be surrounded by creating an unusual, almost melody-chaotic picture that made Oscar squeeze a sword tightly, thinking about further steps. It was then that Oscar noticed as a soldier fell nearby with an arrow, and at the same moment a few more arrows mercilessly flashed, but he covered his friend in time with his shield in time. The soldier, recognizing Lord Oscar, asked if he could get up, because there were many ordinary people from the house of Alman, and Oscar could not allow the power of the clan to be broken. Oscar loudly urged a friend to save everyone, emphasizing that they would surely return from the battlefield alive. Adrien watched the battle, could not understand. His soldiers did not advance, and the enemy seemed not desire to attack. The experiment struck the enemy after falling lost his head because the archers, instead of shooting, moved to another sector that surprised Adrien. This seemed incredible. Adrien, pouring anger, ordered to retreat because Caroline Alonso, together with his father, gradually defeated the enemy. Adrien stood in full shock, without understanding how this could have happened, until General Panther told Heracles that they had coped with lightweight cavalry. Then Hercules noted that Adrien finally realized the essence of the situation. The legend of the prominent commander who had passed the mountain ranges, covered the half-continent, and drove the Lemurian Empire into an angle, thanks to a strategy based on the harmony of the number of cavalrymen of combat capacity and the brilliant command. This tactic is based on the speed of the armies brought great results, and was worth carrying it with it until the last breath. Thanks to the full surrounding strategy, Adrien's army was closed on all sides by depriving it of maneuver and defense. Adrien ordered to quickly change the course of battle. He called Hercules to open the attack by archers, demanding an instant response. Not having time to navigate, he began to fall at a terrible speed, and on all sides flew arrows, scattering allies. Frightened to the depths of Adrien's soul, dropped to his knees in full shock. His army was on the verge of defeat, although the strategy of the environment guaranteed the victory. The main factor was the numerical advantage of eliminating the Bulgarian cavalry created favorable conditions for the offensive without loss, and without meaningless battles. Fortunately, contracts with unpredictable mercenaries were abolished, and thanks to careful selection of generals, Emperor Hercules was able to create a stable imperial army. The choice of the right weapon was crucial. If the warriors were armed only with blades or halberds, they would not be able to withstand the enemy. The real power of the army depends on the best battle tools. Darius could not manage 20,000 soldiers on his own, only through the transfer of the command of the half of the troops to implement the strategy of the environment. The goal was to create an army from scratch, to increase the combat capabilities of warriors, and to remove foreign forces from the battlefield, while the soldiers, shouting and begging for mercy, were ready to pay any amount for salvation. Warrior vassal of one of the 77 holy nobles could not warn his clan before he had time to say something pierced. The troops did not spare anyone, soldiers hiding behind the shields, shouting at their vassals, calling to negotiate with Hercules, and panic covered them when they trampled each other with their feet. Seeing this chaos, he laughed and asked if everyone was able to see it, loudly calling his brother Adrien. I am grateful that he can repeat the legendary strategy of the environment with his own hands. He felt incredible pride in achieve. Having a younger brother nearby, he was sincerely grateful for his obedience, and further silently watched how many millennia passed from the invention of this strategy, and how many people lost life trying to copy it. Smiling, he thought the elves lived about 200 years ago, ahead of 185 years of invaluable experience, and looking at Hercules with his spiritual eye, expressed the eager expectations. It was only necessary to make sure that the enemy would not break through the further oaths, not to reduce the defense. Although Hercules knew how difficult it is, he stated that until they find a decent commander able to reassure panicking soldiers, they will forever get stuck in a trap, as if no fly would be able to escape after one of the soldiers rushed forward. Small and Hercules were surprised to watch the enemy when the Oscar was breathing, that the Almond house would not be defeated today. Covered with shields, enemy warriors created an impermeable strip, and Oscar ordered their warriors to move forward loudly, calling the archers to restore the system so that no one could break through their ranks. At one point, Dahlia asked if someone would be able to break from the environment. His assessment of chances was 100, and Hercules thought that now this chance could be 1 up to 10. Further laughing, mentioned that even Murian left the battlefield several times. Smiling quickly, he asked Donos to pay attention to the warrior, believing that he found another outstanding talent capable of changing the course of battle. Under the guidance of Hercules, most nobles served by Adriana were destroyed by hail arrow. However, those who headed the mercenaries and raised funds for the troops, arrested people of Christ, and from Adrien, the leader of the uprising, remained only a helmet. deprived of Adrien's protection, fled and arrived in the kingdom Belserand, where he asked asylum, knowing that his strength was no longer enough for battle. The troops looked over and quickly captured Adriana, who stood in full shock without understanding that he was so aggressively watching, and what exactly thought against him. Requiring immediate release, Adrien asked loudly that the enemies of the king were planned to speak to him in their language that he would understand, although he had to realize the true situation. Thus, the plan of usurpation of the throne of Adrien was defeated during the war. Army Hercules had 37,100 surviving and Adrien had no one left. The traitor of the throne was sued because no one could allow impunity in such cases. On the third day after suppressing the uprising, Adrien, along with hundreds of conspirators, was convicted of his crimes, and the judge, flipping the notes, demanded short and laconic answers. Hercules, performing the duties of the judge, asked the guilty why he participated in the battle, and the man replied that he did it to protect the majesty of Hercules from the danger that is coming from the inside. Hercules, persistently demanding truth, asked why the accused proclaimed Adrien emperor, if his words testified to treachery and lies. The guy faded with fear, barely replied, as if trying to hide his lies, that caused a barely noticeable smile of the judge. The judge noted that the aristocrats with great power deceived his wealth and soldiers, and asked if he knew who really was to blame for what he agreed, barely interrupted by words. Hercules, suspected of translating guilt on more powerful, warned that if he was a participant of the uprising, he was executed with his family, and the man of the abominable man looked at him with hope. As the head of the family convicted of 30 years of hard labor, he promised to take care of his vassals personally, gratifying the judge, though without unnecessary words. Caroline, that stood nearby, heard the advertisement of a life sentence, and Hercules was sure that in 3 years these events would be forgotten, and summoned the next witness. The judge smiled and asked the guilty or not deceived him by referring to the lower aristocrats that gave a reason for a memorial sentence. It is impossible to exert all the aristocrats for the first time, because during the uprising, they defeated the numerous noble houses, and subsequently their impact. Having lost their power, the knowledge remained only with the name of therefore punishment in the form of imprisonment of a fine and forced work, looks fair. The third reason applies to the key figure on the side of Adrien, high aristocrat of the semi-elfic nobility, of which the judge summoned to the hall. Realizing his position, he apologized to the emperor in writing, and a thin smile appeared on his face that testified to his attempt to maintain status. Despite the support of part of the imperial court, among whom were those who remained in debt, Hans asked for explanations that made Hercules resort to strict action. Hercules tore the paper, announced that the guilty was convicted of imperial ban and loss of noble status, that shocked Hans, which could barely believe the sentence. His face changed instantly, and he pleaded with a judge to postpone the sentence. But Hercules stated that he is isolated for the rest of his life, and after death, the remains burned. Finally, Hercules summoned the next witness to announce that his goal punished the intact nobility, by making them responsible for lower actions, without the possibility of appeal. The nobles that surrendered their recent allies no longer dreamed of opposed to him. Adrien entered the courtroom, and Christopher pushed him forward, forcing him to fall on his knees before the judge. His boldness caused anger. Christopher ordered Adrien to close his mouth because he stood before his majesty, and gnashing his teeth from anger, threatened the judge with his silent insult. Hercules smiled and addressed his older brother, remembering that they had not seen themselves for a long time, or maybe the last time met. He was heard about him only through the second D. Minicus, and the poisonous melon that served him for the first time showed how poison acts on silver, creating a wonderful, ironic combination of taste and danger. Airplane will go down in history thanks to the tactics of the full surroundings. In a few hundred years, he remained the only one who managed to successfully apply this strategy that caused adversity admiration of opponents. Hercules asked his brother whether he realizes that along with the Bulgarian army, they have a real chance of winning the open battle, where the support of mercenaries can change the situation. Adrien quietly stated that he is not worthy of the throne, because the throne should inherit from his father, who always emphasized and Hercules considered him brazen. Judicial and present, he proclaimed that this lying emperor had no right to sit on the throne of the prophecy, sent not by the archangel Jibril, and the gods themselves made him the rightful ruler. People mentioned Gabriel, and asked whether he really bought the same when the archangel who had no one saw before Adrien, that presented a pen from the wing of Gabriel. Hercules understood the sign and asked to invite Gabriel to the hall, because his presence confirmed the legality of the authorities, and all including Caroline looked at him with amazing surprise. Ezekiel looked coldly at his brother and announced 3 conditions to swear allegiance to the emperor, to recognize the illegal invasion of his territory, and to take responsibility for the actions of the nobles who followed him. First, he had to swear to his emperor's unconditional humility, a friend to recognize unlawful invasion, and tender to take responsibility for the actions of nobles. Only then he will be able to save his life. Adrien, without lowering the head, stated that he pleads guilty and bears full responsibility for the events, asking the mercy of Hercules to preserve his own life. Hercules, considering a decision wise, condemned the accused Adrien Giuliano of the uprising leader to lifelong detention by ordering to immediately take him back to the dungeon. As soon as the warriors tried to capture Adriana, the wine sharply cut ropes with scissors and cut his opponents, shouting Hercules that he was going to kill him, and made an attempt to attack. At that moment, Caroline rushed to Hercules to protect, and Christopher with Galf was ready to repel the impact instantly. It was then that the same Archangel Jibral appeared before all that he mentioned God, and emphasized that such could not be tolerated. Adrien, with surprise and horror, asked the Archangel why she defended this false emperor, because earlier he argued that he was real, and everyone around could not understand who he was talking to because no one could see him. The girl laughed and said that she had no intention of talking about the murder. She stated that Adrien himself was an imposter, and warned him not to try not to become an emperor, though he did not understand her words because she claimed he chosen by the gods. However, she added that it could not be true for one sole reason. Having reinforced, Gabriel opened her real face. She was a demon combining the features of Hercules, Adrien Froze, and Horat, and Hercules Wise. Adrien went crazy. He shouted the insult to his brother, demanded his crown, and Galf called him a freak, declaring that he finally went crazy. Christopher also argued that under no circumstances it is possible to mention it on the grave of His Majesty. Devil that wandered in the air behind the emperor's back, I ask him to take his greetings as a sign of indomitable power. So all the guilty were punished, and thanks to this, the festive banquet went without interruption. In addition, Hercules, looking at one of the men, asked if he could guess why he would like to test his wisdom here. He addressed the almond Oscar, to whom General and Galf were looking angrily. Oscar leaned before the emperor and stated that he had already announced his readiness by opening the sword and ready to bear any punishment. Hercules said he was wrong in his judgment and did not intend to judge him, despite the fact that 2 older men now ridiculed Oscar. He wanted an Oscar to become a general that at first shocked the young warrior, because he could not believe that he was elected because he fought on the enemy's side. Hercules explained that he watched Almond's house for a long time, but because the head of their home made Adrien's side in the struggle for the throne, he had to arrest and deprive the lands and dignity. The head of his home was forced to stand on the side of Adrien without having a choice, and thus found himself aboard the sinking ship, which led to the destruction of his house. This greatly affected the course of the war, although Oscar believed that he was not the best candidate for the role of the general because there is other to whom this role is more suitable. Although Hercules did not even know what he says. After all, it was he who was able to escape from the Oscar surrounded. That Hercules noticed it was noticed, because the tactic of the call was designed to cause panic in the enemy's ranks, depriving them of their ability to resist, and he successfully escaped this circle of torment. Under the rain, under the pressure of enemy forces, he kept calm and thus saved the lives of his subordinates in equal terms. Anyone else would break, and Hercules praised his leadership qualities, that the powerful army needs prominent commanders, and stated that with his help, their troops would become even stronger. In addition, he felt that it was a wonderful opportunity to restore the honor and glorious name of his home by laying the basis for future victories. Oscar was extremely grateful to the emperor, and the Almanese house felt his charity. Now their home was at its disposal, and they would do everything for the future of the country. Most of their families were deprived of the noble rank and sent to the prison, though they avoided the most rigid punishment. Hercules, not paying attention to the crimes of his family after all of this, strongly invited the one who considered his trust leaving his family fault behind. Skorbut asked him to take care of him because his younger brother was missing, and Hercules smiled, hoping to teach these elders, and Oscar gladly agreed. Finally, everything ended. 2 glasses stuck to each other, commemorating the end of a long and grueling day. In the dark room, illuminated only the candles of Carolina and Hercules, set a new order after resolving the issues of ancestors and former vassal countries. The older brother immediately rebelled. After hard work, every piece of food seemed particularly delicious. Caroline smiled in reporting that the boss enlisted, and Hercules quietly drunk from his glass, enjoying the moment. Hercules went closer to Carolina and asked why she remembers other men when they were alone. A little embarrassed, she replied that it meant a completely different, because it was waiting for this moment for a long time. Hercules glared at Carolina in her outspoken outfit, assuming that that is why she was so attracted to him. So he never forgot how she blushed in a servant's suit. Gently putting Carolina on the sofa, Hercules stroked her on the cheek and suggested becoming his wife, declaring love with his quiet but decisive voice. The girl was surprised by the proposal, until Hercules, breaking the sprout of the grapes and spilling from it the ring, wore him on her finger. Carolina looked at the new decoration, felt the warmth of true love. Talking to her, he said that she loves her and dreams that she becomes his wife together. They will be able to build a bright future for the country. And Caroline wept. Sincerely agreed. She smiled through tears, confirming that this union would become a symbol of a new era for the empire. The people with a trepidation greeted the emperor, who breathed a new life into the Lemurian Empire, that once found himself on the verge of falling the name of Hercules, and his feats and reign under the title. The story continues. And still, Hercules, accompanied by Carolina, with a smile waved everyone, declaring hope for new victories and prosperity of the empire.